And live now from Capitol Hill, the House Foreign Affairs Committee holding the second of two hearings on the implications of a nuclear agreement with Iran. Congressman Ed Royce, California, chairing the committee. And we're going to be hearing from Joseph Lieberman there on your screen, former senator. He'll be speaking as a witness during the hearing. He's now heading up the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. You can also see in our shot there Darrell Issa. He was speaking earlier with Code Pink's Medea Benjamin and also retired general and former director of the CIA, Michael Hayden. And again, Chairman Royce issuing a statement on this final Iran nuclear agreement that was announced this morning by President Obama, saying that Iran won't even have to cheat to be a step away from the bomb, dominate the region, secure its oppressive regime at home. He says Secretary of State Kerry and his team have worked very hard to get this deal, but in many ways their work is just beginning as this agreement now comes to Congress for approval. And this hearing starting shortly here on C-SPAN 3.
This hearing will come to order. Today, the committee continues to examine the Obama administration's nuclear diplomacy with Iran. We thank our witnesses for joining us this morning. And the administration, of course, has just announced a hugely consequential agreement. In testimony before this committee, Secretary Kerry told us these negotiations would be used to dismantle Iran's nuclear program. That was the goal. Instead, this agreement allows Iran to retain a vast enrichment capacity, to continue its research and development, and gain an industrialized nuclear program once key provisions of this agreement begin to expire in as little as 10 years. The President told us that Iran does not need to have an underground fortified facility like Fordo in order to have a peaceful nuclear program. Yet this military complex will now stay open. While the Obama administration officials first told us that Iran's missile program would have to be addressed as part of a final agreement, they failed to mention that addressing the program means taking restrictions off. We're talking here about the ICBM program that Iran has, taking those off in just 8 years. As Secretary of Defense Carter testified just last week, quote, "The reason that we want to stop Iran from having an ICBM program is that the I in ICBM stands for intercontinental, which means having the capability of flying from Iran to the United States," unquote. And as we know, countries build ICBMs for one reason: to deliver weapons. And recently in this negotiation, at the very end of the negotiation, this is what Russia and Iran pushed for: the ability for Russia to transfer this technology. This is what Russia would like to do: transfer this technology to the regime. At that same hearing, our top military official gave his best military advice. Quote, "Under no circumstances should we relieve the pressure on Iran," unquote, when it comes to the arms embargo. But that comes off in just 5 years. On the critical issue of inspections, just a few months ago, Secretary of Energy Moniz said that, quote, "We expect to have anywhere, anytime access," unquote. But anywhere, anytime has weakened to something called managed access. Managed access, more accurately, should be called manipulated access, as any process with Russia, China, and Iran at the table will be treated exactly that way. It will be managed. It will be manipulated. The inspection regime will be manipulated by those with something to hide, and this has been the past experience with Iran that has cheated on every agreement so far. We might feel better if the United States was able to permanently constrain Iran's worrying nuclear program. But the key restriction, the ability to enrich at high levels, begins to expire in as little as 10 years. That's 10 years. Most Americans will take 3 times longer to pay off their mortgages. 10 years from now. Once these restrictions expire, Iran could enrich on an industrial scale, claiming the desire to sell enriched uranium on the international market, as France does. Iran could also enrich uranium to levels near weapons grade, claiming the desire to power a nuclear navy, as Brazil is doing. All these activities are permissible under the NPT, and all would be endorsed by this agreement. Indeed, the President himself, President Obama, said of his own agreement, in year 13, 14, 15, Iran's breakout times would have shrunk almost down to 0, unquote. As a result, the U.S. and its allies will be left with no effective measures to prevent Iran from initiating an accelerated nuclear program to produce the materials needed for a nuclear weapon. And Iran surely would be able to speed toward a nuclear weapon faster than international sanctions could be placed and reestablished on that regime. One nonproliferation expert told the committee last week that this sunset clause is, in his words, a disaster. The essence of this agreement is permanent concessions in exchange for temporary benefits, and that's only if Iran doesn't cheat, like it has in the past and like North Korea cheated. As one witness described to the committee last week, the deal is in many ways a bet. The bet that the administration is taking is that in 10 or 15 years we will have a kinder, gentler Iran. Just a few days ago, Iranian President Rouhani joined a crowd which, if you followed the piece in the New York Times, the crowd were chanting "Death to America." This was their Quds Day rally on the weekend, and the posters read "Death to Zionism." And as Rouhani was walking, this reporter asked the question about the nuclear negotiations. And President Rouhani said, "The future is bright," as people behind him were chanting, "Death to America, death to America." So President Obama has decided to place all his chips on the fact that the death to America chance will soon disappear. This committee has to ask itself whether we are willing to roll the dice too. I'll now turn to our ranking member for any opening comments he may have.
Thank you, Chairman Royce. I appreciate the Chairman's continued focus on making sure that this committee gets the opportunity to thoroughly discuss and debate the merits of this newly announced agreement with Iran. I know once the final deal is submitted to Congress, the Chairman and Ranking Member will move quickly to set up briefings and hearings as we move forward toward a vote on the deal. In the 18 months since the P5+1 began negotiating with Iran in an effort to prevent it from acquiring nuclear weapons, we've had a lot of discussions about centrifuges and stockpiles and breakout times. And we now know basically what an agreement looks like in terms of infrastructure. But we still await details as to exactly what kind of access IAEA investigators will get, how potential violations will be dealt with, how the so-called snapback mechanism will work, and what a new UN Security Council resolution will look like. Secretary Kerry and his team have spent an enormous amount of time and energy on these negotiations, and I applaud their commitment to diplomacy, and I appreciate their ability to negotiate significant limitations on enrichment and nuclear stockpiles. I hesitate to speculate on the deal as a whole until we receive all of the details. I do have some serious concerns, however, about various aspects of the deal which were extensively reported from Vienna this week. In particular, one, Iran's need to come clean on its past nuclear activities. Two, its access to all suspected nuclear sites. 3, the timing of sanctions relief and the impact on the region. And 4, ensuring that an arms embargo remains in place to prevent the spread of weapons to terrorists. First, along with most of my colleagues, I've been very clear from the outset that Iran must come clean on its past nuclear weapons work, a demand repeatedly made by the administration. Yet, as has been the case for years, Iran has been unwilling throughout these negotiations to cooperate with the IAEA on its parallel investigation into the possible military dimensions of its program. Iran's intransigence has made it difficult for many of us to imagine how we could expect Iran to comply with the terms of a deal. If they've stonewalled the IAEA for a decade, will they continue to find ways to do so under the comprehensive deal, or will a deal make that impossible? This is why upholding the integrity of the IAEA's PMD investigation is so vital right now. So I will await details as to exactly what the new roadmap signed by Iran and the IAEA will entail. Further, I'm concerned about access. We're told this agreement is not based on trust, it's based on transparency and verification. So I wait to see in greater detail how the final agreement deals with resolving IAEA access to suspected sites. Will we have the access we need, or will Iran be able to block inspectors? If media reports are correct and one visit to Parchin is granted, will that be enough to gather the information needed? How far have we strayed from the anytime, anywhere inspections that the experts had said should be part of any deal? Third, I remain concerned about the timing and implications of sanctions relief. How extensive are the nuclear-related steps that Iran has to take in order to receive relief? How will stonewalling or suspected cheating on its commitments be dealt with? And will Iran have access to its frozen assets, well over $100 billion, all at once, and by what date? And where does the money go? I know that this was touched on last week in part 1 of this hearing. Iran's behavior is not going to change as part of this agreement. That's something that's been acknowledged. In fact, Iran's support for nefarious regional actors and designated terrorist organizations has the potential to grow under any deal. And while it's true that some of the sanctions relief will have to go toward fixing domestic economic problems, one can imagine the havoc that Iran's terror proxies could wreak with even $1 billion more. This needs to be something that we understand better. And that brings me to my fourth and perhaps most troubling concern, which emerged as a sticking point in the final days of negotiations, the lifting of the UN arms embargo. Now, I understand that international sanctions are intertwined and they're complex. And I understand that there is a current disagreement among the P5+1 and Iran as to what constitutes a nuclear sanction. But it's extraordinarily difficult to imagine that the UN Security Council resolution that will result from the comprehensive agreement will not continue the existing restrictions on Iran's ability to export dangerous and military hardware to its terror proxies for many years to come. Quite frankly, the apparent resolution of this issue in some ways is baffling to me. Why do we believe that Iran's dangerous support for terror groups will change in 5 years, or that its desire for ballistic missile technology will wane in 8 years? From the beginning, the administration has said that it's dealing with the nuclear issue separate from our other issues with this regime, whether meddling in neighboring countries, its holding of American citizens, or its sponsorship of terrorism, which will be dramatically more dangerous when the arms embargo is lifted. And finally, I want to again raise the issue of the 4 American citizens held or missing in Iran: Jason Rezaian, Saeed Abedini, Amir Hekmati, and my constituent, Robert Levinson, the longest-held American in history. Regardless of what transpired in Vienna this week, Iran must know that the United States will never stop working for the release of our citizens. I applaud and I thank the committee for its commitment to seeing these innocent Americans return to their families. I appreciate the efforts of our negotiators to raise the issue. And members of this committee and all members of Congress should have these Americans in their thoughts as they review the terms of this agreement. So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to receiving the details this week so that members can begin to evaluate its merits. The agreement can't just be judged on what would happen in the absence of a deal today or tomorrow or 60 days from now. It must also be analyzed by what will happen under an agreement in 5 years, in 8 years, in 10 years, and beyond. The measure of this deal will be whether the national security interests of our nation and that of our allies will be strengthened for decades to come. And I look forward to a meaningful discussion and analysis of these issues in the days and weeks ahead. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. This morning, we're pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel. Senator Lieberman represented Connecticut for 24 years. He was chairman of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. He is currently the co-chair of the Iran Task Force at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and he is a senior counsel at the firm Kasowitz, Benson, Torres, and Friedman in New York. General Michael Hayden is the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Previously, General Hayden served in multiple and other leadership positions, including as the director of the National Security Agency and principal deputy director of National Intelligence. Ambassador Nick Burns is the Roy and Barbara Goodman Family Professor of Diplomacy and International Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He served in the United States Foreign Service for 27 years, during which time he served as the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and the ambassador to multiple posts. Dr. Ray Takei is Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He was previously a senior advisor on Iran at the State Department. He has authored 2 books on Iran. So without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record. Members here will have 5 calendar days to submit statements and questions and any extraneous material that you might have for the record. And we will begin with Senator Lieberman, if you would like to summarize, and we'll go to questions after your opening testimony.
Thanks very much, Chairman Royce, Congressman Deutsch, and members of the committee. I'm grateful for the opportunity to testify before you today at a really critical time. The negotiation between Iran and the P5+1 has now produced an agreement which will come before you shortly. Each of you will have to decide whether to endorse or reject it. I personally, looking back at my 24 years of service in Congress, cannot think of a more consequential vote that each of you will cast in Congress for the future security of the United States and indeed the security of the world. And I cannot think of a better committee to lead the House of Representatives in its review of the proposed agreement with Iran, because this committee, under the leadership of Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and today Congressman Deutsch, has built a really strong record of nonpartisanship, repeatedly putting the interest of America ahead of the interest of either political party. If there was ever a time for that kind of nonpartisan leadership, it is now on this agreement. The fact is, Chairman Royce, Congressman Deutsch, your opening statements give me confidence that is exactly the way you will go at this. Mr. Chairman, I want first to, before I get to my reaction to what happened today, to thank President Obama, Secretary Kerry, Secretary Moniz, and all their staff for the extraordinary effort they put into these negotiations. You will hear in a moment that I have very serious questions about the agreement that these negotiations have produced, but I have no questions about the sincerity and good motivation of the administration in pursuing the negotiations. In the time I've had since the agreement was announced a few hours ago, and based on the framework agreement that came out in Lausanne in April, I have reached a conclusion, which is that there is much more risk for America and reward for Iran than should be in this agreement. It is not the good deal with Iran that we all wanted. Let me explain why I reached that conclusion based on what I know now. I was a member of the United States Senate when the first sanctions legislation for Iran was passed nearly 20 years ago, and privileged to play a role in the drafting and passage of every subsequent sanctions bill. Each of these measures was adopted by overwhelming bipartisan majorities in the House and Senate. In each case, Democrats and Republicans in Congress came together despite resistance and outright opposition from the executive branch, regardless of which party controlled the executive branch at the time. There's no question in my mind that when we united across party lines in Congress to pass these sanctions bills, it was with a clear and simple purpose: to prevent Iran, the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world, from ever possessing a nuclear weapons capability. In fact, key provisions of the legislation we adopted explicitly stated this goal. Mr. Chairman, Congressman Deutsch, members of the committee, this is not what the agreement announced today does. In fact, what began as an admirable diplomatic effort to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapons capability dissolved into a bilateral negotiation over the scope of that capability. The agreement announced today temporarily delays, but ultimately allows Iran to become a nuclear weapons state, and indeed legitimizes Iran's possession of the nuclear capabilities that it has built up, much of it covertly, in violation of international law and in breach of its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Mr. Chairman, this is precisely the outcome that for years we in Congress fought to prevent. This is precisely what we enacted legislative bipartisan sanctions to stop. And this is the biggest reason why I respectfully, based on what I know today, ask you to vote against this proposed agreement. For under it, Iran will be granted permanent and total relief from nuclear sanctions in exchange for temporary and partial limitations on its nuclear projects. That is the essence of why I believe this is a bad deal for America, a bad deal for Iran's neighbors in the Middle East, and a bad deal for the world. The rabidly anti-American, anti-Israel, anti-Sunni Muslim Islamic Republic of Iran will have nuclear weapons. This agreement, if approved, takes Iran's nuclearization, which previously had been unacceptable, and makes it inevitable. Mr. Chairman, you've talked about the bet here, and Congressman Deutsch also, that this agreement will moderate the regime in Iran. This is a bet not based on fact. In fact, it is a bet based on hope over experience we have had with Iran. We've got to judge this country not just by what its representatives in the negotiation have said, but really more by what its government has done and is doing. In the months and years since negotiations began with Iran, while its foreign minister has been negotiating with the P5+1, and I might say charming the international media, the regime in Tehran has continued to build up its nuclear weapons capabilities, expand its support of radical proxies that threaten its Sunni Arab neighbors and Israel, improve its intercontinental ballistic missile capacity so its weapons one day reach Europe and the United States, and spew out the most vile and violent rhetoric toward America, Israel, Britain, and lately Saudi Arabia. The rhetoric would be bad enough, but the Iranian government has acted on that rhetoric, sponsoring repeated terrorist attacks that have killed Americans and Israelis, Arabs, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, from Argentina to Iraq, from Saudi Arabia to Syria, and a lot of places in between. You mentioned the rally, Mr. Chairman, in Tehran last week. I would only add that around the same time, the editor of the Tehran newspaper, Kayan, who is selected by Iran's supreme leader and is assumed to reflect his views, wrote that the United States, quote, which currently terrorizes humanity as the sole superpower, will one fine day cease to be visible on the map of the world, end quote. How can we have any confidence in an agreement made with such a government? The answer is it's hard in any case, but the only way we can have confidence is if the inspections and verification provisions of the agreement are airtight. And this is based on the history of Iran deceiving and delaying the International Atomic Energy Agency, claiming that its inspectors are spies and it's a tool of the United States, even though, as we all know, it's actually an agency of the United Nations. On first look, the inspections provisions in the agreement announced today fall far short, dangerously short, of the anywhere, anytime access that is needed to have confidence that this deal with the Iranian regime will actually be behaved. President Obama this morning used the term to describe the inspections, where necessary, when necessary. That's a long way from anywhere, anytime. The specific language of the agreement, which I've just gone over this morning, creates a process that can go on for at least 2 weeks of negotiation with Iran when the IAEA thinks it has reason to inspect something going on, and then has an appeal process to a higher board. This kind of, the IAEA, in other words, will have to negotiate with Iran to gain access for its inspectors, even though Iran has a consistent record of refusing timely and reliable access to international monitors in the past. Mr. Chairman, in summing up, distinguished members of the committee, in the days and weeks ahead, you will review this agreement in detail. You will hear different opinions about it and its implications. Based on what I know now, I have personally concluded that the agreement falls far short of what is needed, which is an agreement that reliably and permanently ends Iran's nuclear weapons capability in return for an end to the economic sanctions against Iran based on its nuclear program. I know there will be some who will try to convince members of Congress that if Congress rejects this deal, the result will be catastrophic. Some may try to intimidate and demonize critics of the agreement by arguing that a vote against this deal is a vote for war. Those are false arguments, and I urge you to reject them. And I cite as evidence that the most powerful measure Congress ever adopted against Iran, effectively barring its sale of oil to international markets, was undertaken despite explicit warnings from administration officials at the time that it would collapse the global economy. In fact, it opened the door to the diplomacy that previously had proven impossible. In today's context, rejecting this bad deal will not result in war or the collapse of diplomacy. It will give the administration a new opportunity to pursue a better deal. I will say, as a former member of Congress, I know how difficult the following weeks will be for you. You will be pushed and pulled by supporters and opponents of this agreement. All I can say, and you all know it already, in the end, the best you can do is decide in the privacy of your own conscience what you believe is best for the security of the American people, including, of course, your constituents. Because this is a decision you and we will live with for the rest of our lives. This is a vote whose consequences will reverberate in the lives of our children, grandchildren, and beyond. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Senator. General Hayden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Deutsch, other members, for the opportunity to be here today to discuss such an important topic, and really thank you for allowing me to be in the company of such distinguished witnesses. Mr. Chairman, when I was at the agency, Iran was the second most discussed topic in the Oval Office, behind only terrorism. We discussed a variety of aspects of the Iranian issue. Of course, the Iranian nuclear program was a central issue, but I mentioned that to remind us all that as important as the Iranian nuclear question is, it is part of a larger piece. To paraphrase Mr. Kissinger, Iran still has to decide whether or not it's a country or a cause. We've been negotiating for the past year and a half on the premise that it wants to be a country. But Iran's actions suggest that it still considers itself a cause, a revolutionary power whose identity, in fact, maybe even its domestic survival, has to be drawn from a narrative of unrelenting hostility between itself as the legitimate agent of Shia Islam and the rest of the world. Now, we put all those other issues aside 2 years ago when we decided to isolate and focus on Iran's nuclear ambitions. I get that. I understand that decision. Diplomacy is the art of the possible, not the art of the ideal. During the Bush administration, we too focused on Iran's nuclear efforts, but we need to understand that nuclear focus doesn't make those other realities go away, and that even if we get to a successful conclusion of nuclear negotiations, those other issues remain, and indeed, there's a possibility that the nuclear result will make those other issues even more difficult to deal with. To oversimplify just a little bit, the issue is not just Iran's nuclear program, the issue is Iran. And we need to be careful that our efforts to resolve this issue doesn't worsen the other dimensions of the problem. Now, let me focus on the nuclear portfolio per se. If I were here with a butcher paper or something and drawing a PERT chart as to how do you get from here to there, with there being a nuclear weapon on the part of the Iranians, I'd have three critical paths. One path would be delivery vehicles, the Iranian ballistic missile program. Another path would be weaponization. That is, making a device small enough, rugged enough, and confident enough, reliable enough that you'd actually put it in a nose cone. And then the third path is fissile material, the things you need to actually have a bomb. We have chosen to bet the farm on blocking one path. We have chosen to bet our future here on blocking the path towards the creation of fissile material. The other two paths, ballistic missiles, delivery systems, and weaponization, are effectively off the table. And even here, in this one path, fissile material, I think we have really reduced our margin for error. As Mr. Deutsch, Mr. Chairman, Senator Lieberman have already mentioned, when this all began, Secretary Kerry was claiming that we had not conceded the right of enrichment to the Iranians. And of course, we had. And that was the premise, the price we paid to get the Iranians to the negotiating table. Let me just point out, too, that the Iranians claim they need this nuclear program for the eventual production of electricity. Now, coming from a nation so rich in fossil fuels, I think we have a right to question that. But let me not question that. Let me concede that. Okay? Even conceding that point does not create a prima facie case for Iran to be able to or to be allowed to enrich uranium. Today, there are 20 countries around the world that rely on nuclear power that do not produce their own fissile material. To drive home this point, we have put considerable pressure on a responsible and trusted government in South Korea not to do what this nuclear agreement allows the Iranians to do. Similarly, Mr. Chairman, as you've already mentioned, the President said that Iran didn't need the heavy water reactor at Iraq, the buried facility at Fordow, for a peaceful nuclear program. And although the agreement suggests these facilities have been modified, we need to see the fine print. They continue to exist. Overall, the Iranians get to keep 5,000 centrifuges of an older type at Natanz, which the administration says is part of a package that always keeps them 12 months away from having enough fissile material for a weapon. But I'm concerned about how much R&D, research and development, the Iranians will be able to do on centrifuge technology. We all have to look at the fine print of the agreement, but the last public announcement by our side has been the phrase limited R&D, which could mean an awful lot of things to many people. I'm also concerned about our failure to demand an accurate accounting of the possible military dimensions of the Iranian program. Mr. Chairman, this really has special significance. It's not just what they may have done in the past to position themselves with regard to weaponization. The Iranians have been stiffing the IAEA for years on this issue. And now we are going to rely on the IAEA for verification of this new agreement, after seemingly having taught the Iranians that if you stiff these guys enough, the requirement to concede will go away. Given past Iranian behavior and deception, will the agency be able to conduct anywhere, anytime inspections? That's always a concern and already been well handled. I know we've got to look at the fine print to see what managed inspections are like, Mr. Chairman, but let me give you a way that I've begun to think about this. Inspections should have been at the technical level. Inspections should have been driven by an IAEA decision that this international body had a technical reason for visiting facility A, B, or C. The managed inspection program puts that decision at the political level. And I just don't see a happy outcome that would evolve out of that kind of arrangement. There's an awful lot to talk about, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to belabor all these issues, some of which have already been raised. But I do want to bring up one point. in discussing the new agreement, many have tried to bring in the pattern of inspections that we agreed with the Soviets under the START Treaty and the SALT Treaty. One of the administration's officials said that we don't insist on being able to get into every military site because the United States of America wouldn't allow anybody to get into every site. That's just not appropriate. Mr. Chairman, that suggests an equivalency here, the kind of equivalency we did have with the Soviets, because after all, we were entering into a voluntary arms control agreement with them. This is Iran trying to get out of the penalty box for violating multiple UN Security Council resolutions. This isn't a neutral playing field. The burden of proof should be on the Iranians that they are adhering to an agreement, not on us to prove that they are not. So again, as I said, inspections, managed looks at the political level, not wise, and this sense of equivalency, I don't think is an accurate reflection of what's really going on here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, General Hayden. Ambassador Burns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Deutsch, members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to be here, and I'm here with friends and people I respect very much. Mr. Chairman, I think we all start from the presumption, all of us who have looked at this issue for a long, long time, that it's in the national security interests of the United States to deny Iran a nuclear weapon. Both President Bush and President Obama have taken the position they will use any means at our disposal, including military means, to accomplish that. Now, the route taken by both the Bush and Obama administrations doesn't start there. The Bush administration sought negotiations with Iran. Iran turned us down. That led us to sanctions. The Obama administration, with the help of the Congress, and I'd say the leadership of the Congress, pushed stronger sanctions that really made a difference on the Iranians. The Obama administration has now come back with a negotiated agreement for your consideration. I'd say two things about it. This is among, I think, the most difficult, complex agreements that any of us can hope to judge. It's filled with very painful trade-offs. There are risks in acting and following this agreement, and there are risks in not acting. And I certainly agree with Senator Lieberman. From my perspective, this will be one of the most consequential and important votes that any of the members take in your time of office. I was just trying to think this morning, for our diplomatic history, you might have to go back to the League of Nations vote in 1920 for an agreement where Congress is going to play such a central and directing role as to whether we go forward or whether we don't go forward. I worked on Iran policy for President Bush and Secretary Rice for 3 years as Undersecretary of State. I helped to sanction Iran. I believe we've got to contain their threat in the Middle East, and we have to stop them. But I also believe that President Obama's policy is worthy of your support. I'm going to support it because I think it's the best alternative. If I could have designed a perfect alternative, it would be a 100-0 victory for the United States and the submission of Iran. That alternative is not available to the United States. And whether we oppose it or whether we support it, we've got to think in the real world about what the alternatives have been. Here's the alternative that President Obama and Secretary Kerry have followed. They think that this agreement will effectively freeze Iran's nuclear program for the next decade. It will deny it a nuclear weapon because it won't have the fissile material that Mike Hayden talked about, General Hayden, for the next decade. It closes out the route towards fissile material. Iran's plutonium reactor at Arak will be effectively put offline. The core will be dismantled. The spent fuel will be taken out of the country. They won't be able to develop a nuclear weapon through plutonium. The enrichment program at Fordow and at Natanz, Fordow will be closed completely. Natanz, of course, they'll still have 5,000 to 6,000 centrifuges, but of a lower power than the advanced centrifuges for the next 10 years. But their store of enriched of uranium will be at 3.67% at 300 kilograms, their store of uranium. That is not weapons grade. They will not have the weapons grade uranium to make a nuclear device because of the restrictions at the Natanz plant. Right now, the Obama administration has said publicly that Iran may be 2 to 3 months away from a nuclear weapon. With this deal, and there's really no dispute about this, for the next 10 years, as their program is frozen, Iran will be a year away from a nuclear weapon. So I think the administration can make a case, whether you agree with them or not on the ultimate deal, that the program is going to be frozen, the plutonium and uranium enrichment programs. And that, I think, is a very important attribute of this deal. Second, Iran will now be subjected to inspections that it's never been subjected to before, 25 years under the additional protocol of IAEA inspections. Third, should Iran cheat, I assume they'll try, given their past record where they've lied to us, to the United Nations in the past, then we have the ability to reimpose sanctions Congress would. The United States would have the opportunity, any future president, to form a coalition much like the present coalition to sanction them. Fourth, this does give the United States a chance to resolve this problem diplomatically, peacefully, through a tough-minded negotiation. And I don't say that lightly, because I'm someone who believes that we should keep the threat of force on the table and that any American president would be justified using it if we felt Iran was close to breakout, close to a nuclear weapon. But we're not at that point. No one anywhere in the world is contesting that the Iranians are close to actually a nuclear weapon. And so the use of force is really right now not pertinent to this discussion, although it's an option for us in the future. If we have a chance to avoid a third major conflict in the Middle East since 9/11, and if we can stop Iran in the process, I think that is a good course for the United States. But, Mr. Chairman, let me tell you, I don't think this is a perfect deal. And I've had trouble, just as a private citizen, trying to weigh the risks on both sides and weigh the pros and cons. If I were a member, I would want to focus on some of the questions that Senator Lieberman and General Hayden have already focused on, because I agree with their skepticism. I would want to look at the fact that the Iran's program will be suspended and frozen, in effect, in mothballs for 10 years. But when that 10 years is over, the superstructure of the program will be intact. Iran would have the theoretical right to build back up a plutonium or uranium route to a nuclear weapon. That is a weakness of this agreement. That's a trade-off. This was a real-world negotiation where we received some benefit, the freezing of their program for 10 years. But that program is not being entirely dismantled, and we have to understand that. Second, I think it's important that the IAEA has 25 years, will have 25 years of insight into Iran's program. But will they have a clear line of sight? Will they have unfettered access? What in practice does managed access to a nuclear plant mean? I think it means that Iran's going to write some of the rules about how its plants are inspected. And certainly questions have to be asked about that as well as about military dimensions. Third, would we actually be able to reimpose sanctions should Iran cheat or fundamentally violate the agreement? None of us know, because we're talking about a hypothetical situation some years, perhaps into the future. But it would require a tough-minded American president, whoever we elect in 2016. It would require us to assemble a coalition that took 10 years to build. I think the Europeans will be with us. I wonder if the Russians and Chinese will. So as I look at this honestly, these are real trade-offs. This is not a perfectly designed agreement. We had to compromise, and we had to give, and that's where, as General Hayden has described it, and I agree with him, that's where we made the compromises. But, Mr. Chairman, I'd say this. I think the only way to look at this is not what is the ideal solution, because the ideal solution is not available to us. Is this the best alternative? President Obama and Secretary Kerry's route. I can think of two other alternatives. One, which a lot of people have talked about, is should we have just walked away? Should Secretary Kerry, as our lead negotiator, simply said this is not good enough? Should he have left the negotiations? Should he have withdrawn American support for these negotiations? We could have done that. But as someone who helped to put the P5 together, as well as the first 3 UN Security Council sanctions resolutions in the Bush administration, I think I know what would have happened. Our coalition, which is global, which contains every major country in the world, I think would have frayed and ultimately dissolved. Countries would have gone their own way without the leadership of the United States. I know what would have happened to the sanctions regime, and that's our leverage against Iran. That's what brought them to the table. It would have dissipated or dissolved over time, because the Chinese would want to go for energy contracts, and the Indian government would want to import more oil from Iran. And even our friends in East Asia, our allies, would want to go back to a normal trading relationship. So the no-deal option, that we walk away and just sanction further, the United States can sanction all it's want, and I respect what Congress has done, and it was very important. But what got Iran to the table was the global sanctions. It was Japan and South Korea and India not buying as much oil and gas. It was the European oil embargo. It was the European financial sanctions. If you walked away and the coalition dissolved, there goes the leverage of the sanctions. So for me, if I have to weigh that walking out no-deal option versus President Obama's option, I favor President Obama's option. One more option available to the United States, we could have gone directly to the use of military force. General Hayden would be a far greater authority than I would on this issue as a military person, but I believe the United States has the capacity to effectively destroy Iran's civil nuclear facilities. That might buy us 3 or 4 years. I don't know what the numbers are. That might give us a great grace period. But you can't bomb the scientific knowledge that their engineers and their scientists have. They know how to mine uranium. They know how to convert it. They know how to enrich it. They know how to assemble a nuclear warhead, we think, we fear. And so that military option is really not a strategic option. It's a tactical option. It buys you time. Well, President Obama's option buys us 10 years, where we can be reasonably assured that their program is frozen. So I don't think these other options work for the United States in the real world of international politics and international diplomacy. And that's why, as I look at the alternatives, I think President Obama is worthy of your support, and I certainly am going to support him. Mr. Chairman, 2 quick points. At the same time that the Obama administration will pursue this very difficult agreement with Iran on the nuclear issues, I think we're going to have to push back against the Iranians in the Middle East because they are on a tear. They have become the kingmaker in Syria. They're unfortunately, the most influential country in Iraq. They're running arms to Hamas in Gaza, to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they're supporting and instigating the revolt of the Houthi tribes in Yemen that have torn that country apart. If you will, they're making a big play for power in the heart of the Sunni world. That's against the interests of all of our Arab friends, against Israel and against the United States. So I think we're in the incongruous position, I certainly am, of supporting a nuclear deal and yet hoping and believing that President Obama needs to push back through a strong coalition with the Arab countries against Iranian power. And I would hope that President Obama and the Obama administration in general would make up with Israel, would end the war of words between the White House and the Israeli Prime Minister, would be to reinforce our military relationship with Israel as well as the Gulf states so that we can contain Iranian power in the Middle East. I think that's a very important imperative it's racing right alongside the debate on the nuclear issue as we speak. And finally, let me say, as someone who served in both Democratic and Republican administrations, I would hope that we could have a bipartisan debate in our country, among citizens, and certainly on Capitol Hill. There are obvious differences between the Bush and Obama administrations, but both sought negotiations. Both wanted to have a negotiated outcome. That's what we were aiming for in 2006 and 2007. When Iran denied it to us, we turned to sanctions. Thanks to the Congress for those sanctions. Very important. But we're going to need bipartisan unity and support for our president if we're going to contain and ultimately defeat this threat by Iran that is in front of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Takei.
Thank you, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Deutsch, for inviting me back to this particular forum. As a junior man on the table, I'll stay within my allotted time, especially since I don't. Judge Poe usually would cut me off, but he's not here right now. The ever-vigilant Judge Poe, I should say. Since the advent, I think, of the Iranian nuclear crisis in 2002, 2 principles have guided the United States negotiating position. From 2002 to 2013, those 2 positions were what kind of a civilian nuclear program Iran is entitled to, and the position was, given its practical needs, and Iran has no practical needs for enrichment, it should be allowed only a symbolic nuclear program. such a symbolic program would allow the Iranians' leadership to save face, while at the same time there would be assurances that such a symbolic program would not be used for military purposes. The second position that guided the United States policy from 2002 to 2013 was that Iran can rejoin the NPT community once it established the trust and confidence of the international community. These were positions of the Obama administration endorsed, embraced, and persuaded the 5+1 country, including Russia and China, to accept. It is precisely these two principles that the administration has jettisoned in 2013 interim accord, Lausanne framework, and codified in the recent comprehensive joint plan of action. The notion of practical needs has been replaced by something called a one-year breakout period, with acknowledgement that has already been made that that 1 year is not static and will alter to zero in the concluding stages of this agreement. And the notion of trust and confidence of the international community has been replaced by a sunset clause, whereby an arbitrary time clock will determine when Iran can proceed to an industrial-sized program. Industrial-sized program not that dissimilar to Japan, should they want one. Japan can be trusted with such technologies. Iran should not. Japan doesn't want to bomb. Iran does. All these significant issues aside, this deal and its implications have to be articulated in the context of a changing nature of Islamic Republic's foreign policy. It is important to note that the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei today stands as the most successful Persian imperialist in modern history of Iran. In the 1970s, at the height of his power, the Shah never had control of Iraq. He never had commanding influence in Syria. Lebanese factional politics always eluded him, and the Gulf states rebuffed his pretensions. Today, as Nick and others have suggested, the Islamic Republic has a commanding position in Iraq and deep penetration of the deep state. It is the most significant external power in Syria. Through Hezbollah, it has a lethal proxy that can employ not just for manipulation of Lebanese politics, but also in various fronts in the Middle East, and of course in the Gulf and other aspect of America's fracture alliances give Iran ample opportunity. There is a debate, and it's a rather curious one. What would the Islamic Republic spend its money on? Imperialism has its costs, and some of that money undoubtedly will go to the tempting imperial opportunities that are out there. But I do believe that the administration has one case. Some of the money will undoubtedly be spent on domestic concerns and domestic needs. Hassan Rouhani belongs to a wing of the Iranian politics that have always been interested with what they call the China model, whereby you can purchase domestic dissent by offering economic opportunity. So in that particular sense, you can make a case, and I think a rather plausible one, that the Rouhani administration has been one of the most repressive in the post-revolutionary state. Iran's burdened citizens will require some sort of a relief. And along the China model, the idea is that by granting them a measure of economic rewards, you can purchase domestic consent. And it's particularly the case because the Islamic Republic, in my view, continues to be haunted by the Green Revolution of 2009. So to have any hope of succeeding in his aim, Hassan Rouhani needs an arms control agreement as much as Ali Khamenei's Islamist imperialism. In the end, this deal may not rest on trust, but it does rest on hope. The hope that a decade from now, the Islamic Republic will be a different regime, a benign power, at ease with global norms, inclined to live at peace with its neighbors. A power that is no longer animated by anti-Americanism and anti-Zionism that have so long fueled this ideological engine. After watching the Islamic Republic for 2 decades, in its own idiom, in its own language, it is a hope that I have difficulty sharing. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to just go to the question of the arms embargo. And, you know, this was a last-minute addendum to this agreement, a demand in the negotiation that the UN lift the arms embargo as it related not just to conventional weapons that Iran could better arm Assad and Hezbollah with, but also it goes to this issue of Iran's capability to get access to the international technical assistance that it seeks to improve their ICBM program. And last week, Secretary of Defense Carter and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Dempsey both sounded the alarm about what this would mean if they get this capability to have an ICBM reach the United States. And clearly the Russians stepped in at the last minute of the negotiations. Clearly Russia wants to transfer this technical assistance to Iran. This is the most recent issue that I think caught us by surprise. And I think the other element of surprise was the discovery that in the middle of this negotiation, about a month ago, that Iran had committed to transfer to Hamas not just the funding to rebuild the 35 tunnels that had been built before under Israel, but also a new generation of rockets and weapons, and then most recently the additional discovery or announcement that Iran was going to transfer precision guidance systems to the 100,000 rockets and missiles that Hezbollah has at its disposal, aimed right now at Israel, but not quite as effective, obviously, because of the Iron Dome, as they could be if they had these precision guidance systems. The fact that Iran is willing to do this in the middle of the negotiation and to demand the upfront payment of this signing bonus, which evidently they're going to use for this purpose, is something that really drove the attention here of a number of members of Congress over the last few days as this information is surfacing. And I would like, Ray, your comments on this, or, you know, General, you might have some insights as well.
I mean, Nick can talk about the conventional prohibitions in UN because they were negotiated in 2006 Security Council resolution. As I understand it, that those embargoes on conventional arms had to do with Iran's regional behavior and had nothing to do with the nuclear dispute that was ongoing at the time. I do think that irrespective of what happens to the arms embargo, and I think it's unfortunate that it's not going to be sustained, Iran has developed a fairly robust indigenous defense industry that additional money that it uses can certainly enhance in terms of illicit procurements and so forth. So there is always going to be a problem of Iranian transference of missile technology and other forms. But obviously, under this particular prohibition, once it expires, they have access to more sophisticated technology.
Well, and now it'll go both ways. Yeah. So now not only will they be able to export from their technology that they've developed more easily to their allies, but they're also going to be able to import from Russia and China the technology they need for ICBMs or surface-to-air weapons and so forth. Yeah. Ambassador Burns?
Mr. Chairman, there's no question that the Iranians were trying to split the P5 in the last week of these negotiations with this proposal. Point one. Point two, there was no way we could have accepted this. And so I was trying to dive through the details coming over here. If we can maintain these UN weapons embargoes for both import and export for 5 to 8 years, that's good for the United States. It's painful.
Well, hold on. 5 to 8 years. In 10 years, they're going to have the capability for undetectable nuclear breakout, 10 years plus under this agreement. Why would we want to agree to 5 years lifting and 8 years for the Russian transference of that capability? Why would the United States sign off on such an agreement, Ambassador?
And I'm not here, of course, to represent the administration. I'm just a private citizen. This is a painful trade-off. I would have hoped that we could have defeated it completely. It's a trade-off that apparently our negotiators felt they had to make. So how would we then work once these embargoes are lifted 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now? We'll have to use the power of the United States to work on countries to prevent the sale to Iran, because Iran's been violating the other part of it. They've been selling and giving our arms to insurgent groups throughout the Middle East.
Let me just ask General Hayden.
Yeah, very, very briefly, Mr. Chairman, I find it incoherent. In my prepared remarks, I try to describe going from the broad to the specific. We've got an awful lot of complaints about broad Iranian behavior. That's the arms embargo. There are lots of ways of stopping a nuclear program. We've dismissed the ballistic missile part, focus only on the nuclear. So to get Iran down to this agreement, we have simply taken a whole bunch of things off the table that we legitimately could have included. Now we get to the agreement, and the Iranians are now walking back up that ladder and now including as concessions to them things that they had refused to discuss with us when we went into the negotiations. I don't understand why the ballistic missile sanctions or the conventional weapon sanctions are even in an agreement on the nuclear program.
General, as I mentioned in my opening statement here, the administration was once on the same page as Congress on this issue of anywhere, anytime inspections. But the Iranians pushed back very hard. I remember the deputy head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps boasting that they will not even be permitted to inspect the most normal military site in their dreams. So now we're signing up for something called managed access. And a report overnight says that inspectors will get access to critical sites only after consultation with the Iranians, with the Russians, with China, and other world powers in this negotiation. We wanted to get this within 24 hours. That was the original idea. Inspectors could get in within 24 hours. This agreement, if we're lucky, would get inspectors access in 24 days after all of the steps that Iran has insisted on. But that's only predicated on the idea that we have cooperation from Russia and China in backing the access. So my question here, as you said in your testimony, we never believed that the uranium at Iran's declared facilities would ever make its way into a weapon. We always believed that that work would be done somewhere else in secret, as you said. So how confident are you in any sort of managed access process that includes Iran on the committee that determines whether or not we have access?
Mr. Chairman, I've got several issues. I already mentioned one about the conventional arms, snapback sanctions. I'm not sure how that happens. But this is the one I'm most concerned about because, again, we've eliminated our margin for error. It's all about fissile material. So a couple of just very core points. Number one, I would never come to you and tell you that American national technical means will be sufficient for verifying this agreement. Without an invasive inspection regime, I would not, while I'm in government or now, tell you it's okay, we'll know enough to give you sufficient warning. So that really puts the weight of effort on the IAEA's ability to go anywhere at any time. As I suggested in my remarks, Mr. Chairman, we have taken that from the technical level, that this international body has an issue. It just needs to resolve. All right? We have taken it from the technical level and put it at the political level. And I just think that that's a formula for chaos, obfuscation, ambiguity, doubt, and then finally, we're just not going to be able to tell you for sure where the Iranians are.
Thank you. Mr. Lieberman, final comment.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, this question really, in my opinion, highlights the greatest specific weakness of the agreement announced today. I mean, we're dealing with a country that has proven over and over again that they will not play by international rules. They have constantly deceived and delayed international inspectors from the United Nations, not from the United States. So now we're taking a risk of making this trade where we end sanctions on them in return for them essentially temporarily freezing their nuclear program if they, for the first time in the last 3 decades, actually do honestly what they say they will do. And the one guarantee or hope that we could have that they would do it was the anytime, anywhere, airtight inspections. The agreement that came out today is the greatest disappointment in this regard because it is, I mean, basically it sets a highly bureaucratic process that goes at least 21 days during which Iran can remove anything covert and in violation of the agreement that they want to. So I think this is the point. I urge members of this committee, members of Congress, focus in on the section of this agreement on access. This is one that Iran won hands down, and consequences for this overall agreement are really devastating.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank the witnesses for a really thoughtful presentation, and I think the establishment of a really important tone for what I hope will be a very meaningful and serious discussion over the coming weeks and months about this crucial vote. I raised earlier my concern about access, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the exchange that just took place. But Ambassador Burns, I'd like to ask you. You walked through. I think you gave an excellent presentation on what our negotiators were able to accomplish and the trade-offs that they needed to make, and the skepticism that you have about some of what's in this agreement. And I want to focus on one in particular. The goal in all of this, the goal of diplomacy is to reach, in reaching a diplomatic solution, is to reach a peaceful solution so as to avoid the use of military force. And what I'm trying to grapple with as we look at this, as we get into the details of this agreement, is what that looks like over time. Initially, you said that it's really important that at the same time that we move forward with these, with this nuclear deal, that we push back against Iranians in the Middle East. And you detailed the many ways in which they've looked to exert their influence throughout the region, the spread of their terrorist infrastructure. And I would ask, getting back to the issue of resources, when they satisfy the terms of their nuclear-related conditions and have access to their frozen assets, whether it's $1 billion or $50 billion, if we acknowledge, as Dr. Takeda said, that they're going to invest in their own economy, but clearly some portion of the money is going to be used to support what they're doing in the region. If the goal is peace, short term, is it likely that the infusion of additional money is going to lead to less peace and more violence through their terror proxies?
Thank you very much, Mr. Deutsch. And I would say that the goal here for the last 10 years has been to deny them a nuclear weapon through diplomatic means, negotiated solution, if possible. And if not, we resort to military means. I think that's what both the Bush and Obama administrations have tried to do. So yes, it's a peaceful solution, but it's one that's in our interest, where we think we earned enough at the negotiating table so that it's worth doing. That's how I understand what President Obama's logic is here, and that's why I support it. You've asked a good question. The problem we've got is that we're dealing with two different Iranian governments. We have I think, a genuinely reformist in their context, Prime Minister Hassan Rouhani, and a genuine reformer in their context in Javad Zarif, the foreign minister. That's the veneer, the government we've been dealing with in Vienna. But there's another government, and that's Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And that's a hard-bitten, cynical, aggressive, assertive, violent organization. They're the people pushing into the Middle East. And so I assume, as Dr. Takei does, that some of the money from sanctions relief is going to go to economic improvements because they've got terrible political and economic problems at home. They're going to have to rebuild the infrastructure of that country that's withered away under sanctions. Some of it's going to go into arms and to supporting terrorist groups. And so at the same time that it's, I think, in our interest to pursue the nuclear agreement, it's definitely in our interest to, I think, strengthen our coalition with Israel and the Arab countries and to push back on the Iranians.
So let me ask you this way. You talked about two different governments. Have we spent all of this time negotiating with one to get to an agreement only to see that government then hand off responsibility going forward to the other government that's wreaking havoc throughout the region? I mean, Dr. Takei, let me ask you that.
I'll touch on this in the following way. I often hear that you can transact an arms control agreement and maintain your pressure on Iran. I'm not sure if that's possible. And if you want to bring out the Soviet-American experience, I'm happy to go into that as well. The principle means that the United States tries to discipline Iran has been through economic sanctions. We never use military force against them and so on. This agreement stipulates that over a period of 10 years, the United States will unwind its principal coercive instruments, so central bank sanction. In this agreement, central bank sanctions are to be waived. Is that terrorism sanctions? Is that an aggression sanction? Is that a human rights sanction? It's a sanction that's going to be waived. The coercive menu that the United States has for doing what Nick Burns wanted to do, contain Iran, is going to lessen. It's going to diminish. Soviet-American experience, the era of arms control in Soviet-American relations was 1973, arms control agreements, ABM, SALT I, SALT II. It was also one of the most aggressive decades in Soviet history, culminating in an unprecedented event, invasion of a country outside the perimeter of Soviet influence, Afghanistan. Countries that are, revolutionary countries that are beneficiary of arms control agreements tend to be more aggressive, and the ability of the United States to enforce, contain, reverse their aggression tends to diminish.
So just finally, Dr. Kay, I just want to make sure I understand. The reference to our negotiations with the Soviet, negotiation of arms control treaties with the negotiations, you suggest we should view more as a warning sign than it?
Yes. I challenge the thesis that you can maintain an arms control agreement and resist aggression by a revolutionary state.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Eliana Ross-Layton in Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I'd just like to remind my good friend Ambassador Burns that while he says that there are two governments, Rouhani and the hardliners, both were very much active just this past Friday when they were chanting death to America, death to Israel. So we like to talk about these two separate entities, the hardliners and the moderates. They have one goal in mind, and they say it, death to America, death to Israel, but we ignore that. But according to reports, the White House seems to have caved on almost every one of Iran's demands, blowing past its own red lines on enrichment, on centrifuges, on verifications, on inspections, on sanctions relief, and on coming clean on past nuclear ambitions and military dimensions. And along the way, the administration has made excuse after excuse justifying every Iranian violation of this interim deal in order to continue negotiations, providing billions of dollars in sanctions relief, and is set to provide billions more. And now we know that Iran, what will it do with its additional sanctions relief and the influx of international investment that it's going to receive from this deal? It's going to continue funding its hegemonic ambitions throughout the Middle East, its support for terrorism throughout the world, just as it has been doing in Lebanon and Syria and Yemen and Iraq. And as reported, it is clear that this deal is a far cry from every red line that the White House itself imposed. And it's a lower threshold than the 6 UN Security Council resolutions. And I look back on and read these resolutions, and I think, wow, that's like a fairy tale. Once upon a time, the world powers got together and said, this is what we were going to demand. The administration kept lowering the bar time and time again, defending its the violations of the Iranians every step of the way, going legacy shopping. Here's another item off the shelf, the Iranian nuclear deal. People will be worried about whatever else is going on in their in the music industry and in the film industry. Nobody's going to pay attention. Let's look at the shiny keys. The administration has also reportedly said that it would only lift nuclear-related sanctions, even though officials would never describe exactly how that was defined. But now reports indicate that the administration has caved to the Iranian claim that all the sanctions are nuclear-related. So, do you believe that the U.S. and the UN should be lifting sanctions imposed on Iran for its human rights record, its ballistic missile program, its support for terrorism, including the arms embargo? And following up on Chairman Royce's exact point, General Hayden has pointed out that the IAEA must be allowed to inspect these suspect locations, military sites, et cetera. But you had told us, and your colleagues believe, that weaponization would never occur at declared facilities, would be done in the secret facilities. It's now being reported that the deal would allow suspect activities as suspect sites to have access only after the P5+1 consultation with the Iranians. Secretary Kerry has stated that inspecting Iran's military sites, coming clean on possible military dimensions, isn't even necessary because the U.S. has full knowledge of Iran's activity, but many in the intelligence community, including DIA Director, former DIA Director Michael Flynn, have argued that the limits, there are real limits on U.S. intelligence in Iran. It makes this impossible. How can we trust Iran to give UN inspectors access to suspect sites after consultation with P5+1 countries? How hard is it to gather intelligence in Iran? How can we have full knowledge of Iran's activities without access to all these sites? And finally, Mr. Chairman, many supporters of the Iran deal have been floating the fantastical idea that Iran will change its behavior as a result of this agreement, become a better neighbor in a more stable Middle East. How will lifting the sanctions and influx of new money from sanctions relief change Iran's involvement and influence throughout the Middle East? It will have more money to be involved in its hegemonic ambitions. There's not enough time to answer all of the questions that I have. And not only these sanctions that the UN supported once upon a time, we're done with that. We might as well just rip that one up. That's not happening. And what about our U.S. sanctions? You know, Mr. Chairman, we talk about what sanctions we will lift, but there are some within our control, but there's so many executive order sanctions that the President can lift, so many provisions that he can waive. I know that I'm out of time, but I'm greatly saddened, sickened, and frustrated over this deal. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Thank you. Let me first set the record straight. The sanctions, especially the secondary sanctions, are the only reason that Iran made any concessions at all. Those sanctions were imposed by Congress over the objection of the executive branch. For 30 years, Congress had it right. The executive branch had it wrong, except for those occasions when the House had it right and sent bills over to the Senate, and then the President blocked them in the Senate. I'm disappointed in this deal for all the reasons that have been brought up. The arms embargo was not a nuclear sanction, yet it's being waived. The Iran Sanctions Act will be waived, even though there are basically 9 reasons recited in the agreement in the act as to why we imposed it. Only one of them is nuclear. And this sanctions relief is so complete that we're even going to import things from Iran, not oil, but only the things that we don't need and they can't sell to anybody else. Dr. Takei, I think you're right in saying they're going to spend a good chunk of this money that they're going to get for domestic purposes. But in addition, they'll spend it on graft and corruption. They're good at that. They're going to kill a lot of Sunnis, some of whom deserve it and many of whom do not. And then they'll have a few billion at least left over to kill Americans, Israelis, and work other mischief. Number of people have talked about the hope that we're going to see a change in the government. Keep in mind, we impose sanctions to change the government on the theory that if you deprive a government and its people of economic benefit, you put pressure on them to change. Now we're going to shower them with money. Okay, it is their own money, but in any case, they're going to get economic benefit is usually not the way to cause a government to lose its grip on power. General Hayden brings up missiles. I'll simply point out that you can smuggle a nuclear weapon inside a bale of marijuana. It's not the classy way to do it. Obviously, Iran wants missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they have only one reason for creating them, and that's to deliver a nuclear weapon. Political pundits all over the various channels are all asking, is it a good deal? Did Obama do a good job? That's their job. They're political pundits. They can be politicians or politician wannabes. We're here in the real world. We've got a disappointing deal that has the full support not only of the American president, but also of the P5+1. Imagine us going on a Codel to Italy and telling them that E&I should not invest in Iranian oil fields even though President Obama thinks they should. We'd have good wine, but I don't think we'd achieve our purpose. So we're in the real world. Senator Lieberman points out that we can endorse or reject this agreement. I agree with you, except there's something else we could do. We could refuse to endorse it and refuse to reject it, which is probably what we're going to do. But I should mention, this deal does have some good points. The good points are in the first year. 90% of the stockpiles are being shipped out. 2/3 of the centrifuges are being mothballed. So if we don't take any action in the first year, we get the benefits and the detriments of the first year of the deal. The 10th year of the deal is absolutely terrible. Iran has free access to 10 times as many centrifuges, or 100 times as many centrifuges, each 10 times more efficient than the ones they've developed so far. And so I think our focus needs to be, what do we do to prevent year 10? We can pass a resolution. We could bring up a resolution of approval. It would be voted down overwhelmingly, and then in the future, Congresses and presidents would be free to take action, hopefully before year 10. That would be the strongest statement against the agreement. What's more likely to happen, unfortunately, is we'll have a resolution of disapproval. It'll pass. It'll be vetoed. The veto is likely to be sustained. I think it will be sustained. And so we reach the same position, which is Congress declares that it doesn't like the agreement, doesn't approve the agreement. We simply do so in the weakest and most pitiful way, the final vote being a victory for those who support the agreement when we don't get 2/3 to override. So I think this deal is going to go into force. What I'd like, and I realize I've left a little time, hopefully the Chairman will be indulgent, but what advice do you give presidents next decade as to how to prevent Iran from having an industrial size enrichment program where, in the words of President Obama, their breakout time would be almost zero? I'll start with General Hayden.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I don't have a good answer to that question. This deal guarantees the reality you just described.
Well, this deal is not binding on the American people or future American presidents. So let's say Iran kind of lives within the deal for the next 5 years, is economically stronger. Another president can say all options are on the table. What can a president do to make sure that this terrible year 10 does not go into force? Any other witness have a response? Senator Lieberman.
Thanks, Congressman Sherman. The first thing I want to say is respectfully offer a somewhat different viewpoint from the outside about what will happen here in Congress. I'm not prepared to say, based on conversations I've had with members of both chambers and both parties, that this agreement will be approved or disapproved, but a presidential veto will not be overridden. I think people's minds are open. People are concerned. They're going to look at the agreement. I myself have said that whether Congress would override a veto by the president would depend on the specific terms of the agreement. And now we've seen the agreement, and the fact that it legitimizes Iran eventually as a nuclear weapons power, and that, even more important in the first instance, the access, the inspections provisions are full of holes and don't give us any hope that this country, which has constantly cheated in its international agreements, will abide by the agreement here. So I think it's definitely possible that this agreement will be rejected by Congress and a president's veto overridden. And to me, that would be the best of all results. If it's not, the latitude of future presidents, I suppose, will be expanded if there is an initial rejection of the agreement and not a president vetoes it and the veto is not overridden, because a future president can look back and reopen negotiations, perhaps even ask for a reimposition of sanctions based on Iranian behavior and based on a premise that Congress will have set, which is that a majority of members of both houses voted to, and in the Senate it will take 60, voted to reject the agreement.
Oh, can I just say one thing about this, Congressman Sherman? Congressman Sherman, on page 3 of this agreement says, upon expiration, Iran will be treated in the same manner as any other non-nuclear state party to NPT. That's Japan. You don't like that phrase, you have to renegotiate it out of this agreement.
Yes, and you have to have a president who demands that and puts all options on the table.
I do think that one path would be, and unfortunately it's not in this agreement, it has to be renegotiated, is to suggest that after 10 years, all the parties to this agreement, 5+1 and Iran, will vote whether to extend the restrictions. There is a precedent for that. It's called the NPT. Recently, when NPT expired, all members voted after 25 years to actually extend its particular provisions permanently. That has to be renegotiated in this particular agreement.
The answer to your question, in my view, is that President Obama and his successor do 3 things. Vigilance on inspections, number 1. Number 2, maintain a coalition to reimpose sanctions if necessary. That's possible, although difficult. And 3, retain the right to use military force if necessary. There is a strategy here where this agreement can be implemented successfully.
Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this extraordinarily timely hearing, and thank you for our distinguished witnesses. You know, not only has the Iranian government just orchestrated death to America demonstrations just a few days ago, but they continue to hold Americans, Pastor Saeed Abedini, Amir Hekmati, Jason Rezaian, and Robert Levinson. We've had hearings on that, and they still are incarcerated, subjected to cruel treatment by this regime, and now a deal with them. Senator Lieberman, I think your comments about how this falls far short, more risk to America. Ambassador Burns, you mentioned that it's not a perfect deal. Who expected a perfect deal? That's almost like a straw man argument, with all due respect. We hoped for a better deal, where other issues like ballistic missiles, the whole issue of enrichment, which always was a foundational premise of a deal, they're off the table. And now there will be enrichment allowed. And again, I think that was a major, major mistake. In a statement of what I consider to be bad faith, President Obama vowed to veto, to block any congressional move to block this agreement. This is day one. He's already talking veto. If it's such a good deal, why not persuade Congress and, by extension, the American people about its contents? Instead, veto card goes right up. Red card, it's not going to go forward. Managed access, one of several Achilles' heels. How is that defined? How does that apply to suspected military sites? On a regional nuclear arms race, we all want peace, and nuclear weapons are the antithesis of peace. Will this begin or foment a nuclear arms race in the region? Perhaps, Senator Lieberman, you could touch on that. Ambassador Burns, you talked about how the deal buys us 10 years. Well, if Iran is newly infused with cash and the sanctions were not aggressively or as aggressively implemented as they could, there were always some caveats that were allowed, including oil to China, which was a lifeline. Now we have a situation where they're going to get huge infusions of cash, which will hurt, obviously, the region. It'll be a multiplier effect, force multiplier for terrorism. That is a very serious problem. The existential threat to Israel, you know, we all know what Netanyahu said, an historic mistake for the world. Perhaps you might want to comment on that. And let me ask you also, one of the key questions is whether or not the Obama administration and the P5+1 partners can be trusted to punish Iran or even proactively acknowledge Iranian violations of the agreement as they are likely to occur. What will happen? Or are we going to submit it to a committee and nothing happens? Senator Lieberman?
Thanks very much, Congressman Smith. So let me just respond to the question about non-proliferation. And this is going to be an ironic and, I think, painful result, which is that an agreement presumably to reduce the presence of nuclear weapons in the Middle East, because it eventually allows a radical state like Iran to get nuclear weapons, will in fact encourage other powers within the Middle East to invest in nuclear weapons capability, and that makes the Middle East, which is already boiling with various kinds of conflict, even more literally explosive. Look, the Saudis, officials within the Saudi government have already said to people, if an agreement between the P5+1 and Iran enables Iran to become a nuclear weapons power, they're not going to wait till that happens. They're going to begin to build up their own capacity for nuclear weapons. So the fact that I looked at this in my opening statement from the point of view of America. I said this agreement has much more risk for America and much more reward for Iran than it should. It's not the good deal that we all wanted. But governments in the Middle East are also making the same calculation throughout the Arab world and, of course, Israel. And they're going to take actions based on that calculation. If we think it's a bad deal, I think they're going to think it's a terrible deal because it's their neighborhood. And the result will be exactly the opposite of what was hoped for here, which is a more peaceful Middle East. It's going to be a much more violent and potentially explosive Middle East.
General Hayden?
Very briefly, Mr. Smith, the more the administration argues it's this deal or a vote for war, the more you take off the table the ability of the United States to use military power to coerce the Iranians. I don't think anyone believes that is a realistic option at the moment. And frankly, I don't think they've believed that for more than a year or two going back. And so that does actually weaken our position in order to get the kind of behavior we want from the Iranians.
Let me just very briefly ask about, in the report itself, this is the actual agreement, although there are annexes apparently that none of us have seen yet. It says Iran intends to ship out all spent fuel for all future and present power and research nuclear reactors. It says intends. It doesn't say requires. Is there requirements in this for that? Intends. I mean, that's pretty weak.
I understand it's a requirement.
Then why would they put intends in the text?
I don't know, but I understand it's a requirement. It's part of the deal.
Okay.
Okay.
I'd say it's a good question, Mr. Smith, and one that I'm sure you and the committee will get answered when the administration comes before you to support this agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, we go to Mr. Gregory Meeks of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first ask, I was listening to Ambassador Burns' testimony, and during his testimony, one of the things that he highlighted was if the United States had walked away, if we would walk away, and we just said no, and the other partners were trying to strike a deal. So I guess my first question, maybe I'll ask it to General Hayden, do you think that we should walk away even if that meant the dissolution of the P5+1 and the unity that we have had for both the last 20 months? Would you walk away from such a deal?
Mr. Meeks, I think what's happened is if we did that today, it would dissolve the unity of the P5+1, and we would be blamed for it. And so, but that is a corner we have painted ourselves into.
Okay. So,
by accepting the agreement.
Right now, though, you would agree, then it would make it quite difficult to hold the coalition together. If we walked away, we would get blamed, and so therefore the sanctions that have brought Iran to agree to negotiations, when I think it was also Ambassador Burns' testimony that the Bush administration tried to get Iran to agree to negotiations, and they would not at that time. So there's been a change from what took place at the end of the Bush administration, because we didn't have this outside unity with the P5+1. And if we did not have that now, that could relieve some of the pressure on Iran. And for me, the only thing that I'm looking at in these negotiations is what is the opportunity to stop Iran from having a nuclear weapon.
I understand perfectly. I think the Russians and the Chinese peel off immediately because they don't want to. They didn't want to be there in the first place, and it was actually quite a high level of skill to get them into the circle to pressure the Iranians. I think there's greater hope with the EU, the French, and the British, although, again, we have painted ourselves into a corner by accepting the things we're questioning now. And for us to undo those would make it very difficult.
The problem is, which I intend to find out, is, while the negotiations were going on and who was saying who to what, we weren't in the room. So how those negotiations took place and who was demanding what within the P5+1 becomes important. I think it's important for members of Congress, before we make a decision, is to try to talk to our colleagues in the P5+1, to find out what their feelings are, to find out where they are on this and what's important. It is important to talk to scientists, not just the politics of it, but talk to IAEA, to go to Vienna. I would suggest that members of this committee travel to Vienna and talk to the AEIA and talk to scientists to see if what is in place in this agreement, can they do the inspections? Will that prevent, in their opinion, as scientists, not politically, but as scientists and as much as we can? Because from my viewpoint, having had, and I agree with Senator Lieberman, this is a very important vote. And I can't leave it in a vacuum, because I had another important vote. And that was back when we decided, was talking about Iraq. And there was questions then of whether or not we should have diplomatic relations. Should we debate? Should we go further? Should we have verification? And what happened at that particular point, we said no. There was imminent danger of Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. They had them. And I can remember, the case went to the UN. We took the case to the UN. That there was these weapons. Right. And we're still, and I don't want to go back, but we're still, I think we should learn a lesson, because we're still paying for that when we didn't do everything that we could first. Because if we did everything that we could first and they still had weapons, we could have done what we did anyways. And so here we are again with the opportunity. And I agree that this is not perfect. I don't know any perfect bill that has ever been made in this United States Congress, ever, in the history of our country. Not one. So I'm not looking for a perfect bill.
No, I agree. But the correct question, and I think you've just framed it, is this deal good enough? But we should avoid sliding from that position into a position that any deal is better than no deal. I agree,
but we got to also keep in context that we're not dealing by ourselves or doing it unilaterally. Everything that I hear most saying is just us. Forget about the other 5 partners to this deal. This is what there's other, when you have negotiations, and I think that leadership, people say leadership keeping this group together, that's leadership so that we can get to this point. Because otherwise we don't get here, and we don't have any choices. This at least gives us a choice, a chance. And shouldn't we at least look at it, talk to scientists? I mean, this deal just was struck this morning, for God's sake. We haven't talked to any scientists. We haven't gone to the AEIE to see what they're doing. We haven't gone to Vienna. We haven't talked to our partners in this negotiation. That is our responsibility as Congress, don't you think? As opposed to us just making a decision right today, what we're going to do?
No, that's I think the position all of us have here is the fine print here really matters, and there is little or no margin for error.
Should we go to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Engel, who's not with us today, but both of you provide such great leadership on this issue and other issues of great significance. Let's note that the agreement that was being discussed today is being held with a government entity that holds 4 Americans illegally hostage. Let me note that my staff is preparing legislation that would permit our president and to take non-diplomatic Iranian officials into custody until their government and their clique returns these Americans who they're holding illegally. Now, of course, we won't do that because we don't want to make the Iranian mullah regime angry by doing something like that. In fact, we have refrained. The mullahs have already won a great deal by this elongated negotiation. because for all of these years, we have been refraining from supporting the democratic elements in Iran against the mullahs for fear that it would upset the negotiations over the nuclear deal. So we've already been a loser even before this supposed agreement. What I'd like to ask, does anyone in the panel know whether or not this agreement includes an Iranian agreement not to obtain a nuclear weapon from another source rather than building one on their own?
I think this agreement stipulates that Iran will be member of the NPT, and as a member of NPT, it has foregone, presumably, a nuclear weapons option.
Okay, so the answer is yes, part of this agreement is that the Iranians have agreed not to obtain a nuclear weapon from someone else.
It says Iran will become a member of the NPT, and if it becomes a member of NPT in good standing, then it forgoes the option of actually having a nuclear weapon. It doesn't specify the source of that, but it essentially forecloses the option as a matter of principle.
Mr. Rohrabacher, if I may just add,
yes,
it seems to me that Iran has developed a lot of the nuclear capability that it has today in violation of its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So I'm just offering that as more evidence that Dr. Takei is right. Of course, they shouldn't do this under the NPT, but they violated the NPT wantonly for years before.
I see. So in other words, according to this, if we expect the same type of behavior that they've made with other agreements, with this agreement, they could easily, even with all these other inspections we're talking about, they could obtain, let's say, a nuclear weapon from an illegal source. Now, another question for the panel. We have some people who know about U.S. intelligence, et cetera, with us today. Are there nuclear weapons that some countries or some groups might be able to obtain on a market rather than having to build their own weapon?
Of course.
Of course.
Always watching the North Koreans. We saw the North Koreans build a plutonium reactor in the eastern Syrian desert that was detected just at the last minute. To spin out the scenario that Senator Lieberman has talked about with regard to the Sunnis and how they will respond to this. I mean, one very possible scenario is that the Saudis will then go to the Pakistanis in order to get nuclear devices to balance what they view to be the Iranian threat.
So what we have is basically a situation where we have not refrained from supporting the democratic elements in Iran, which is the real solution, is getting rid of the mullah regime and getting a democratic government in there that doesn't seek to possess nuclear weapons. But of course, we have actually undermined that opportunity by over these last 6 years. And in fact, this agreement may undermine it further. And well, I thank you all for your testimony today, and I think that you've given us a lot to think about, and I would hope that all of us here do our duty, and I don't think it is a tough decision. I think it's very clear that this is a rotten deal, and but we'll keep an open mind to see if we can be convinced that there's some other benefits to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Karen Bass of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a few questions that really kind of focus on the process and also the consequences of our actions. And so a couple of people have asked questions about our partners from the other countries. So I was wondering about the P5+1 and wanting to know if they have a similar process where they're voting in their legislative bodies, what happens at the UN, and maybe you could put it in sequence. Ambassador Burns?
Thank you very much. The P5+1 group was put together by the U.S. and Britain in December 2005. It's been the core of the international effort, and one of the reasons why I am supporting the President's initiative. I think that if you keep this group together, that's the leverage point and pressure point through sanctions, inspections on the Iranians. If the group dissolves, then we really lose our leverage. It's a disparate group. The French, of course, the Germans, and the British will have to go back and report to the Bundestag and the two parliaments on this deal. They're democratic countries. I'm very strongly assured that President Putin doesn't really have to worry about the Duma very much.
So do you have any sense of France and Britain? I mean, will their legislative bodies approve it? What is your sense of that?
My sense of the politics in Europe is that in the main, the parliaments are going to be, and the publics are strongly supportive of this deal. I think that's true in Europe almost across the board. The interesting country here is Russia. We're sanctioning Russia over Ukraine,
right,
and deservedly so. And yet we're going to have to work with Russia to try to keep them on our side here. The country that I think is weakest is China, because they tend to be motivated by commercial purposes, almost to the exclusion of strategic thought. That we have to be worried about, because we have to worry about law and order in the Middle East. And so it's a very difficult coalition. But behind it, of course, you've also got the major purchases of Iranian energy. And I mentioned them before: Japan, South Korea, India. Very important that we keep them in this coalition as well.
How do you see this playing out at the UN Security Council?
Well, I think there's no question that part of the implementation of this agreement will be that there'll be a new Security Council resolution that will put this new agreement into force, that will take away the sanctions, at least those that have been voted upon by the United Nations. And if the 5 permanent members are all in agreement, they will win the vote. They need 9 votes to carry a resolution. I think it's pretty much assured that they will win that particular vote.
Do you have any concerns that any of those countries would exercise their veto power?
No. I think the deal worked out is that they all agree they will not exercise the veto, that they're all going to go forward. This is the way they'll implement the agreement. So I think there's 0% probability that any country would use the veto.
So if we turn this down and we override a veto, what do you see happening then? How does it play out on the international arena? There's all these reports about plane full of people who want to go over and make business deals from various countries.
Yeah.
So if we override the president's veto, what happens then?
I think if the president vetoes a vote of disapproval, if that is then overridden, I think you'll see the dissolution of the P5 group, the breakdown of solidarity around the world on sanctions, the commercial impulse of a lot of these countries to do business with Iran will take over. Iran will then be in the position of getting sanctions relief, right, effectively, from most of the world. But they also won't have any constraints on their nuclear program.
Well, I was going to ask, how would we hold them accountable? I mean, if we back out, then it's not us holding them accountable, but how will the rest of the world in the P5, because it won't be +1.
Iran won't be accountable. Iran will be able to proceed on a plutonium and enrichment program that they haven't been able to do now for 13 months. And this does get to the very important question. We've all tried to define what's the question. My question is, what's the best alternative and option for the United States? And we live in the real world. We're right here in the middle of 2015. I think it's this deal. We can't go back and design a better process 5 years back. I also would disagree very respectfully with Senator Lieberman and General Hayden on one question. If we're worried about proliferation, that the Saudis or another country might want to compete with the Iranians and develop a nuclear weapon or buy one, the scenario for that is a breakdown of this deal that leaves the Iranians without constraints on their nuclear program. The way to resolve the proliferation problem and reassure the Gulf Arabs is to lock and freeze in the Iranian program for the next 10 years.
If we overrode the veto also, how would we get, you said sanctions would break down, and let's just say we wanted to bring sanctions back again. How would you be able to bring them back?
Well, if that happened, hypothetically, obviously the President and the Secretary of State would want to reassemble a sanctions regime with Iran if Iran had broken the agreement and if Iran was proceeding with its nuclear research.
One last quick question.
It would be difficult to do.
Okay. So whether it's 10 years, at the end of, if we get to year 8 and 9, and I'm asking you this based on your previous experience, because it kind of comes across like 10 years happens and then everything goes back to normal. Wouldn't a new agreement begin to be negotiated around year 8 or year 9, or you just sit and wait until 10 years is over?
If you still had the Ayatollahs in control, if you still had a radical government in Tehran, you'd have to put together, I think, another sanctions regime, pressure points on Iran, threaten them, reserve the right to use military force if they sought a nuclear weapon. You'd be back in that game.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We go to Steve Chabot. of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Lieberman, I'll begin with you if that's okay. As has already been mentioned, Prime Minister Netanyahu has referred to this agreement as a mistake of historic proportions. What position does this put Israel in?
Thanks, Congressman. Obviously, Prime Minister Netanyahu and the leadership of Israel is better prepared than I am to make a statement about that, but this is a room full of friends and supporters of Israel, and it's very clear that based on the violent anti-Israel rhetoric of the Islamic Republic of Iran, based on the support by Iran of the terrorists who now threaten Israel, including particularly Hezbollah and Hamas, the idea that the Iranians would have a nuclear weapon in a foreseeable period of time, assuming they kept the promises that they've made about the first 10 years, is very threatening to Israel, and I think will lead the Israeli government to make its own decisions about what it can do to better protect itself. Incidentally, one of the interesting things is, as you all know, the Israeli political system is quite lively, a lot of opposition. But from what I see, the feeling about this agreement and the worry about it in the weeks preceding it is shared across a very broad spectrum of the Israeli political establishment. So to be more specific, the Minister of the Knesset, Herzog, who was the leader of the opposition, has basically said the same things about an agreement, a bad agreement on nuclear weapons with Iran that Prime Minister Netanyahu has said.
Okay, thank you. General Hayden, let me turn to you at this point. When you combine the lifting of the arms embargo and this agreement, shouldn't it be greatly concerning to us, our security, the concern that intercontinental ballistic missile technology and information goes from Russia to Iran, and that puts us directly in harm's way here from a nuclear-armed Iran somewhere down the road?
Well, it certainly puts us in a position of being more threatened by a more capable Iran with or without a nuclear device. The Senator talked about Israel and its position on nuclear weapons and how this really frightens the Israelis. I think there's another element to it. Yesterday, Iran was international outlaw. Today, they are not. And that will allow the normalization of a whole host of relationships, as you're suggesting, that will allow the Iranians to grow in strength. Now, Nick's comment about we need to work hard to make sure that doesn't happen because they are engaged in egregious behavior throughout the region is certainly true and aspirational. But I do think for the rest of the world, this is welcoming this Iran, the one that's not changed, back into the family of nations. And that's very problematic.
Thank you. Dr. Takei, I've got limited time left, so let me put two questions to you if I can. One is, isn't it likely, this deal, that you're going to see a pretty significant reaction by the Gulf states and the Saudis that they have to counter a much stronger Iran now that ultimately is going to have nuclear weapons in all likelihood as a result of this, so that you're going to see, in essence, an arms race there? And secondly, this given 2 weeks' notice before you can inspect, you can move a lot of incriminating evidence with 2 weeks' notice, and then negotiations probably after that as well. Wouldn't that be accurate? And I'll give you whatever time I have left.
Sorry, whether this can lead to proliferation, my suspicion is, my guess is that the Saudis and the Gulf states are going to try to match Iran's capability. Now, Ambassador Burns said that this would happen in absence of a deal, but it hadn't happened in absence of a deal. It hadn't happened in absence of a deal because the trust and confidence that those countries had in the United States and its intentions to severely restrict the Iranian nuclear program. That intention is no longer in practice. This agreement says that Iran will be treated as NPT. I would like to hear, and I have never heard, a defense of the sunset clause. The only thing I hear about the sunset clause is if it's about to expire, we're going to try to not have it expire. That's not a defense of the sunset clause. If you defend this agreement, you should defend why it should expire in 10 years. That's an intellectually consistent position. In terms of your verification demands, the verification procedure will be in place once the IAEA has credible evidence of untoward activity. That's not a card you can play every day, that there's something suspicious happening in a non-declared nuclear site. And then it will ask the Iranian government for permission to deal with that particular. In the annexes that I have seen, I don't know what that means in terms of inspecting the military facility. Do you do environmental sampling? Do you go through the whole thing? I don't know the answer to that. It's not obvious to me in the annexes that I have seen, but maybe I should probe them more. And then if there's a dispute, it'll go to a resolution dispute committee. Every arms control agreement has a verification dispute committee. Once that committee says, well, Iran is wrong and it should have the IAEA should have access, Iran says no, it'll go to Security Council. And Ambassador Burns knows all about the Security Council. Security Council can do lots of different things. The Security Council cannot impose economic sanctions on Iran. There's no country called Security Council. It can recommend national measures, but those national measures will subsequently have to be negotiated on case by case by the United States government, as was done for the past 10 years when successive American diplomats went to Europe and elsewhere, tried to restrict Iranian commerce.
And during that long period of time that you've set out, there are no inspections?
In that particular undeclared site, no.
Thank you. I yield back.
All right. We go to Mr. William Keating of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the witnesses for the seriousness and the tone with which they've conducted themselves in this hearing and the thoughtfulness, as well as my colleagues. I hope this is a harbinger for the way we are discussing this issue going forward, because it is indeed one of the more serious issues we'll have. And I know, for one, I think I speak for most of Congress, that we're just beginning to digest this and no position to take a position on this. Yet, many of your comments have been thoughtful, and I share many of them. That being said, I just want to go back. There's a few areas of interest. Ambassador Burns talked about how the coalition is likely to unravel, and then we'll lose our strength in terms of the sanctions. There's another area that might change if this is stalled or if we walk away from this, and that's the issue that we're negotiating with Iran before they have their nuclear program in place. What would the negotiations be, in your mind, after they have that? How much more difficult would it be? How would they be limited if we wait? I think that's an important question that hasn't been asked. Ambassador Burns.
Thank you. And Mr. Keating, may I just take this opportunity to say I'm one of your constituents from Westport, Massachusetts, so thank you very much for your representing us in Congress.
Well, I'm doubly glad that I commended all of you on your...
I am too. You know, we've had a bitter experience with North Korea that both General Hayden and Senator Lieberman, we've all been involved in this. And once North Korea obtained nuclear weapons, it's become almost impossible to negotiate with them because they've got the leverage right now. And of course, they've got some protection from China as well. So I think that both President Bush and President Obama have been right to try to go at this in a more direct way and try to stop, through negotiations, the Iranians before they cross the nuclear threshold. What President Obama has been able to do, in my judgment, is buy us 10 years. And I agree with Ray and everyone else here, we can't hope that the Iranians will change. I bet they don't. So we're going to have to go through these 10 years with a lot of vigilance, a lot of toughness, and maybe even replay all this 10 years from now. But we bought ourselves 10 years, and we do have international unity. And in the end, even someone as cynical as President Putin doesn't want Iran to become a nuclear weapons power. Russia lies closer geographically to Iran than the rest of us do. He's, in an interesting sort of way, the Russians have not broken consensus despite the fact that we're sanctioning them on Ukraine. So I think this is the time for negotiations. And I do believe, reflecting on the history of a post-9/11 era, we should exhaust diplomacy. And then if it fails, and this could fail, then we always have the military and the military option to rely on. I think that's the proper sequencing.
I'm trying to get in another couple of questions. Let's see if I can. One of my concerns was raised by Ambassador Burns, and Doctor, you addressed your opinion on this. But the idea that if this agreement would result in the Saudis and the Gulf states just moving forward. Now, they're at the 1-yard line, want to use that, to getting to their nuclear program. And there's no doubt in my mind, going the 99 yards, they're going to go do that. So if they're going to get that anyways, wouldn't any decisions by the Saudis or other countries, wouldn't they have done that anyways? Aren't they going to do that? My point is, I hope you're following this, that it's not any agreement that's going to all of a sudden make them go forward with their own nuclear programs. But in the absence of an agreement, they're going forward anyways. At least I believe that. Aren't they? So I think it's kind of a moot point about the other countries moving forward. But I understand your, Doctor, what you said. Does anyone, any of the other panelists have a view on that?
The Gulf states have not moved forward.
No, but if this becomes a reality, one way or the other, they're likely to. That's your consensus?
Go ahead, General.
I'll have a very, very quick view, Mr. Keating. Right now, they really haven't, and they haven't because we go into the huddle with them. We're part of their team. There's going to be a perception that we've not quite switched sides, but we've gone to the league commissioner's office, and we're no longer playing on their squad.
All right. If I could interrupt, because I just want to get the one more question in. Of course, I'm very sensitive to going to the league for sanctions, being a big fan of the New England Patriots, but it's another issue. Quickly, at least I'll raise the question. I don't know if time will permit, but I think the real concern, too, is that if the coalition unravels, you know, that creates a problem. But if Iran violates, how easy will it be to reconstitute that coalition for sanctions again? And that's a real concern. That's my final question.
I think first I should reassure you that I have a lot more confidence in Tom Brady than Ayatollah Khamenei. That goes without saying. So, you know, it's been great to have the P5+1 together. It strengthened our position, but I think we have to talk about trade-offs, which Ambassador Burns has spoken of. I think I'd rather have us reject a bad deal and run the risk of having the P5+1 coalition dissolved than to accept a bad deal, which will compromise our security and that of our allies in the Middle East. I mean, I think in my opinion, part of what's been lost here is that the Iranians needed this agreement more than we did. It didn't seem like that, but they're in a lot more trouble than we are, certainly economically, and they benefit a lot from this. If for some reason the P5+1 coalition falls apart, we're still the economic superpower of the world, and access to our banking system is still necessary for economic growth. And so we have the capacity ourselves to reimpose sanctions on them.
Thank you. I've gone over my time, and other members want to talk, but thank you all. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Joe Wilson, South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm grateful, just as Mr. Keating, for Chairman Ed Royce and Ranking Member Elliott Engel for the bipartisan explanation of the threats to the American people. Additionally, I'm very grateful for the panel being here today. You're making a difference explaining this to the American people. I am disappointed the President has made dangerous concessions when negotiating with the Iranian regime. This regime sponsors terrorists to attack American families and openly calls for death to Americans and our allies, especially Israel. This bipartisan concern, I believe, has been expressed so well today by the courage of Senator Joe Lieberman. Your testimony today that this is a bad deal which should be overridden. Thank you very much for your courage. Foreign Policy Initiative Board member William Crystal wrote today, quote, "It is obviously a very good deal for the Iranian regime, a very bad deal for America. Congress should pass a resolution of disapproval. Congress then should override the President's veto and return America's Iran policy to dealing from a position of strength rather than supplication," end of quote. In the coming days, I hope the American people are allowed to consider the agreement truthfully and hold the President accountable. In an effort to achieve political gain, President Obama has ignored Congress and the American people, and I believe is establishing a sad legacy of a murderous regime with nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles targeting American families. I agree with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This is a mistake of historic proportions. With that in mind, Senator Lieberman, it should be remembered that the Secretary of State designated Iran a state sponsor of terrorism January 23, 1984, over 30 years ago. This was in response to the October 1983 bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, killing over 300 Marines. This was perpetrated, people need to remember, by the Iranian regime. Keeping that in mind, has there been any change of course by the Iranian regime leading up to the negotiations that have occurred today or been agreed to today?
Thanks, Congressman Wilson. This is a very important point. It's easy to get focused on today and forget tomorrow, but tomorrow tells us who this agreement is with. Let me be really explicit about it, as you've been. This Iranian government, the Islamic Republic of Iran, has the blood of a lot of Americans on its hands. The Marines at the barracks in Beirut, the soldiers at Khobar Towers, I could go on and on. Incidentally, hundreds of American soldiers were killed in Iraq by Shia militias that were trained in Iran by the IRGC. So your question is a good one. Has the government changed? There's no evidence of it. Somebody said before that, and I've heard it before, Iran has two governments. I don't think so. Iran has one government and two faces. The government in power is Ayatollah Khamenei and the IRGC. The face that they put out occasionally is Prime Minister Rouhani or President Rouhani, and now in these negotiations, the Foreign Minister Zarif. But does anybody really think Zarif and Rouhani are really representative of their government? No, not in the final analysis. So your question, as you consider this agreement, because you got to remember who you're making the agreement with, is very important.
And additionally, the IEDs, the improvised explosive devices that killed hundreds of Americans in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. I had two sons serve in Iraq, another in Afghanistan. They had to face Iranian weaponry, and for this to be disregarded is incredible to me. And I want to thank you, too. You brought up about the government-sponsored newspaper in Tehran, and people need to know what the exact quote was, and that is that they predicted the U.S., quote, will one fine day cease to be visible on the map of the world, end of the quote. I mean, goodness gracious, what are we facing? And General, by lifting the economic sanctions, what will this do to our efforts to stop the degrading of terrorism, and what does this do to the stability of Iraq, Syria, and Yemen?
Congressman, it just increases Iranian capacity across the board. That is an unavoidable consequence of this. It may be something we're willing to pay the price for. I don't think so, because of the nuclear portfolio, but unavoidably, Iran is more capable of continuing the policies it has been following for the last several decades, and there's no evidence that this agreement or anything else is going to make the Iranians change that course.
Thank you very much, each of you.
Thank you. We go to David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to thank the witnesses for your thoughtful testimony and for assisting us in what will be a very consequential decision, not only for our country, but for the security of the world. So thank you. I wanted to start by saying that I think the objective of these negotiations, at least as presented to me, was always preventing a nuclear Iran, and that it's important that as we decide whether to support or disapprove this agreement, it should be measured against that objective. And there's lots more work to do and lots of action and pushing back that needs to take place. But nobody should have imagined that this agreement would solve all of the challenges we face and result in a complete transformation of the ideology, behaviors, or intentions of Iran. Because if that's the test, there's no question that the agreement fails. The question is, does it achieve a non-nuclear Iran? Senator Lieberman, you just testified that it allows Iran to be a nuclear weapons state and makes it inevitable. The President this morning, in describing this agreement, said, and I quote, that it is a comprehensive long-term deal with Iran that will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon. So I'll start with you, Ambassador Burns. Who's right? I mean, if the objective is to prevent a nuclear Iran, Senator Lieberman has said it's inevitable because of this agreement. The President says it will not happen because of this agreement. That's the question we have to decide.
I respect Senator Lieberman's position here because he spent decades on this issue, and I don't want to take issue with him at all. In this sense, I don't think it's possible to say that this agreement will 100% prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear weapons power. They could achieve that through covert means. So I think that would be the wrong way to look at this. I think it gives us the greatest probability of preventing that, and that's why I'm supportive of it. I see the downsides, and I think Congress will have to struggle through what we've all talked about this morning. Will the inspections be strong enough? Can you reimpose sanctions, right? What's the nature of this regime? But I'm convinced we've got to try this first, and we have to be vigorous in trying to implement it, and if it works, we're ahead of the game. If it doesn't work, we have other options. We do have other options. But I don't think, I would also say, I wouldn't say that if you're opposed to this deal, that somehow leads to war. I think that's false too. I actually think if the deal unravels, the Iranians are smart enough, they won't go to the nuclear threshold. There'll be some ways behind that would not invite a military response. So I think the rhetoric, if you're against it, you're going to get a war. You know, if you're for it, I think you can assure the American people there'll be no nuclear weapon. I think the reality is very complex in between the two.
And building upon that, Ambassador Burns, much of the argument has been made even today that what this agreement attempts to do is buy a decade, buy this period of peace or period of at least Iran not moving toward a nuclear weapon. The argument, of course, being that at the end of that period, some would argue, Iran will be stronger. They'll have greater economic success. They will be able to withstand the imposition of sanctions better than they are today. Our argument on the reverse side is that we'll know more about their nuclear program than we've ever known before as a result of intrusive inspections. So it seems to me that's one of the other questions we need to struggle with is where do we end up? Because presumably, according to the agreement, no options are off the table at the end of that period. Military options, all the options that are available today remain available. The only question is what's the difference in the strength of our positions?
Right. And I think one way to look at this analytically is that there's a lot of risk here in going forward. There's a lot of risk in not going forward and disapproving. And you have to try to weigh the risks on both sides. I think there's a legitimate case to be made, and Ray Takei knows more about this than I do, that there's a possibility this regime is going to change, become less virulent, less aggressive, but we can't bank our strategy on that. Hope it cannot be the basis of that strategy. So we have to be prepared for either outcome. We would take advantage of a positive turn of events. We have to be very tough if 10 years from now this regime hasn't changed and tries to turn back towards a nuclear future.
And Dr. Takei, can I follow up with you? One of the things you said is you challenged the supposition that you can challenge a revolutionary state and have an arms agreement, which is, of course, exactly what this proposal attempts to do. Why do you think we can't do both of those things simultaneously?
I think in the context of U.S. relationship with Islamic, what I was suggesting, Congressman, is it's difficult to maintain an arms control agreement as well as coercive leverage. Because the principal coercive leverage we have exercised on Iran is economic. We have never responded to their military attacks on the United States in Iraq and elsewhere. And the coercive leverage of economics, this agreement commits the United States and the international community to unwind the economic sanctions on Iran over a decade. So your coercive menu shrinks. And once this shrinks from economic instruments, you have military at your disposal. And I just don't think there's a military solution to this. So basically, if you want to pressure Iran, and historically we have pressured it through economic sanctions, that option is becoming less available as you are statutorily committed to unwinding those sanctions.
General Hayden, if I could just ask one last question of you and Senator Lieberman. What do you think happens if the deal is disapproved by Congress, the veto is sustained? What do you think happens next?
We're in absolutely uncharted waters, Congressman. It would depend on the strength of the American argument, the willingness of the administration to go to our allies and explain why we've chosen a new course of action. And as the Senator pointed out, we're a powerful nation on our own. We can impose very powerful sanctions on a variety of fronts across the Iranian economy, particularly the Iranian banking system. But as Ambassador Burns points out, the more international consensus we get, the more coercive pressure we can bring to bear.
Real quick response, Congressman. If this agreement is rejected by Congress, nobody can predict what will happen, but I would say that I would hope that the administration would try to regather the P5+1 and basically go back to Iran and say we couldn't sell it. We got to do a better deal here. And again, I believe that Iran needs a deal much more than we do. The other thing is that at that point, we probably would want to look at increasing sanctions to give them another motivation to come back and making credible President and Congress that we're prepared to use our military power if our intelligence tells us that they have actually turned the corner and are beginning to nuclearize their program.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Michael McCall, Chairman of the Homeland Security Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank the witnesses. In some respects, feel like the train's already left the station. Even if we disapprove of this, it's vetoed and we override a veto, this still goes before the UN Security Council, and unless the administration exercises leadership, those sanctions will certainly be lifted, regardless of what we do in the United States. And I think that's maybe something we haven't discussed here today. And then from a Homeland Security standpoint, what does that? That means we have billions of dollars being restored to the Iranians that can then go into these terrorist operations. We know that they control 5 capitals now, really arguably Tehran, Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and Sana'a in Yemen. That's what greatly concerns me, and I don't know if we can turn the clock back on this now. Now that the P5+1 has agreed to this, when I was in Europe, Mike Codell, you're absolutely correct, Ambassador, they're very supportive of this deal. And primarily, I think because they have a lot of money to be made on this. And so I don't know what we can do to stop it. I can tell you what I'm concerned about is the last minute, as the chairman mentioned, the last minute arms embargo being lifted, which could lead to Russian technology, and the sanctions against the Quds Force being lifted as well. Not to mention, you know, when you look at the track record of the IAEA and whether they can truly perform this mission with unfettered access, which I highly doubt the Iranians are going to give us access to. And when I look at what are they giving us access to? Nuclear facility sites. It doesn't include their military facilities, which arguably is where a lot of this could potentially take place. And then lastly, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, which has been talked about a great deal, if they can mass produce. In general, as you know, the intelligence estimates are indicating by the end of possibly as early as next year could have capability to hit the United States of America. There's only one reason why you produce these things. It's to deliver a nuclear warhead. So all these things put together, in addition to the rhetoric, I think I agree with Senator Lieberman. It's more risk for America and more reward for Iran. I want to end with this because this is probably the worst. When I was in Saudi, I think Senator and General, as you mentioned, they asked me, why are you negotiating with Iran? Why are you doing this? I met with Netanyahu. Why are you doing this? This will result in a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. And as you indicated, Saudis are already taking steps now, maybe working with Pakistan to produce their own nuclear capability. Then Turkey's going to want that. Then Egypt's going to want it, and on and on and on. I think that's one of my biggest concerns here is the result of all this backfiring in a not-so-great result. Senator General, if you could both comment on that.
Well, Chairman McCall, it's good to see you. Of course, I agree with you. All your concerns, your question about what happens at the United Nations if we reject, if Congress rejects the agreement and President's veto is overridden is a really interesting question. I mean, in the most direct sense, you'd think that the deal, therefore, would be dead, so that it would not be, there would not be a basis for going to the United Nations, but based on having read it 1.5 times this morning, I'm not sure I could swear to that under oath. So it's a really interesting question. And again, I come back to what I said before. Let's never underestimate our power. The United States not only is a military power, we're an economic power. And if we continue to apply sanctions which deny Iran and countries that deal with Iran to our banking system, it's going to affect the Iranian economy. And let's never forget that.
General Hayden.
Very, very briefly, Mr. Chairman, I'm trying to play catch-up with the agreement and read the fine print this morning. It's not at all clear to me that this will not be resolved in New York before the congressional review period has expired. And so we may have the administration going to one deliberative body about this before this deliberative body has a chance to vote.
But Chair, if I could just echo that point, I don't know the answer to that either. If the UN Security Council approves this before Congress even has a chance to vote on it, and then what happens, are the sanctions then lifted by the European, our international partners, irrespective of what the United States does? I don't know the answers to this as, this agreement just came out, but I think that's something we need to take a look at.
Mr. Chairman, if I may say so, take the liberty. You're raising a really interesting question, and it may be that one of the points as you start your deliberation here on this agreement that you could achieve bipartisan agreement on is to ask the administration not to go to the United Nations before they come to Congress. I mean, it seems to me that our Constitution requires that kind of respect first for congressional consideration.
Oh, I agree 100%. I yield back.
Good. Let's go to Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, gentlemen, for this very anxiety-producing discussion. I know we all agree that Iran should not get a nuclear weapon. It would put the most dangerous weapon in the hands of the world's foremost sponsor of terror and most likely lead to a proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East region. And I want to say this. I think because of the seriousness of this issue that we have to all take a very objective, non-partisan scrutiny of this issue and this prospective deal. And I think Mr. Meeks made a point also that I wanted to echo, which is, not knowing what went on in the room with our partners makes some of the deal not understandable to me. Because this is one of my, and I don't mean to simplify what's a 70-page agreement that's taken so many, literally years to get to this point, but this is one of my biggest anxiety points, and it's been raised, which is we're going to give Iran billions of dollars. They're going to continue their terrorism all over the world. And then at the end of 15 years, they're allowed to continue to enrich. This is the part that I don't understand. What happens in 15 years? I know I suspect that we were going to know more, which is a good thing. But is Iran going to be nicer, or are they going to be less susceptible to economic sanctions? That's, to me, that's a sticky point. And then on the other side of the coin, though, to me, another anxiety point is, if we walk away and we went to, let's put more sanctions on, do you think us versus them approach, in other words, I know we need our partners to help us with these sanctions. Do you think they would be amenable to, you have to be with us, or there'll be other economic consequences from the United States? So those are my two questions, if someone wants to take a shot at it.
I'd be happy to. I would just say that I think all of us agree on Iranian support for terrorism, on the American hostages. These are vital issues. But there is a reason why both the last two administrations have focused more on the nuclear issue. It is the greater immediate danger. And so in government, as you know, you have to make those choices. And I think the choice is right to have this negotiation. We have to pressure them on the other issues, but you have to go at this issue first and foremost. Second, I don't believe that sanctions, U.S. sanctions alone can work. I agree with Senator Lieberman that we're the biggest economy in the world, and we can do a lot of damage to the Iranians. But what really tipped the balance and drove them to the negotiating table was that the rest of the world got involved too. And if Congress disapproves and the sanctions regime dissolves, you've lost your leverage. Third, in that scenario, and a previous member asked my colleagues to my right about that scenario. If there's disapproval, what would the United States do? We could go back to the P5. I don't think Russia and China would want to form the same coalition and go back to the first step 10 years ago in trying to pressure the Iranians. I think we'd be without leverage, and our president would be weakened. And all the work of the last 10 years, I think, would have been undercut. And that's why I'm strongly for, despite the misgivings and trade-offs that I see, strongly for congressional approval of this agreement.
But Iran will most likely be stronger in 15 years, especially economically.
Well, I would assume they'd be stronger economically. We don't know what kind of country they will be like in terms of their behavior, because we can't look into a crystal ball. So we can't build the policy on hoping they'll change. And there's been too much talk, I think, from some parts of the administration that somehow there's going to be a honeymoon and the United States and Iran will become partners in the Middle East. I don't see it, if you look down the litany of issues that all of us have discussed.
So, Senator Lieberman, do you think we could get sanctions back on the table?
I think if the Congress rejects this agreement, I think the first step would be to try to go back to Iran and urge them to come back to the negotiations. And again, I repeat, just practical politics. The administration can say, we tried our best to sell it, we couldn't sell it. Representatives of the people in our country, constitutional republic, said, no, we don't go with it. If they're recalcitrant, then I think we have to go back to sanctions. I think we can, ourselves certainly. Can we get some of our allies? I hope so. I don't know. I think your other point here is really important. Look, I would have loved to have this be a good deal that closed the door, as we originally said we would, to Iran becoming a nuclear power, and that would have allowed us to end our sanctions on them. That would have had a very tough, airtight inspections regime, which you have to have with a country that has such a record of cheating and deceit and delay. This is not it, and that's the problem, and therefore they're going to get money. So I think of course, we never know what Iran will look like in 10 or 15 years, but I think ratifying this agreement will make it more likely that the radicals who are in charge of Iran will still be in charge of Iran. Why? Because they will use some of this money that they get as a result of lifting sanctions to strengthen their position inside the country, let alone what they'll do to expand what they've done through terrorists and others in the region generally. But they'll have money to use to make people in Iran happier than they are now, and it'll be harder for the opposition, which is there, not supported by us or anybody else, but is there to have a chance to overthrow the extremists.
We're going to go to Ted Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate your expertise on this very sensitive, important subject. I look at the ruling party, the Ayatollah, as a wolf in wolf's clothing. He's made it clear that he wants death to America. He said that numerous times. And now it seems to me that the wolf has made a deal with the sheep not to eat the sheep for 10 years. And then what? Supper? We don't know. My concern is, was there ever any discussions that there needed to be free elections in Iran and let the people decide who should rule over them? Do any of you know of any discussion about that in this deal that has been taking place for some time? Senator Lieberman?
I don't. I assume it was off the table and wasn't mentioned, along with a lot of the other things that bother us about Iran's behavior, like their support of terrorism and their incarceration of Americans, their deprivation of human rights of their own people. Unfortunately, you could go on and on.
Public hangings of political opponents.
Exactly.
Do you agree or not that the best hope really for security, world security, and Iran is that they had a regime change with peaceful elections? Senator Lieberman?
I certainly do. That's the ultimate answer, and we haven't really tried or done very much to bring that about. Incidentally, during the Cold War, even while we were making arms control agreements with the Soviets, we were supporting opposition movements within Eastern Europe, for instance. We were supporting the refuseniks in Russia. So there's a precedent for that.
Does this deal the hope in this deal, based on the premise that we will trust the Iranians to comply?
Well, so as I've said here already, Congressman, I don't think there's any basis in Iranian behavior for the last 3 decades to trust them. And you could recite the litany of the ways in which they've justified that unfortunate conclusion. The one way in which you could have confidence in this agreement is if the verification inspections provisions of it were really airtight, anywhere, anytime, but they're not. They create a whole negotiating process, as we've said, 14 days, 21 days, appeal to a board. It's an invitation to the Iranians to obfuscate and, if they're caught with something wrong, to have the time to get it out of the view of the international inspectors.
In the area of inspections, whether you're in, whatever you're inspecting, giving notice to whoever you're going to inspect always allows them to hide or fix the problem before you get there. It seems to me with 24 days, you'd be able to hide the Grand Canyon or something. But I find that as a problem. Big picture, is it still the policy of Iran today to destroy the United States?
Well, until we hear otherwise, I think we have to say it is.
And Israel as well.
And Israel. And now you notice that last Friday's demonstration, for the first time in my memory, visibly and audibly brought Saudi Arabia into the pantheon of those that the Iranian government wants to destroy.
And then let's talk about Saudi Arabia. Iran wants to be the big player in the Middle East. Does this deal that I have here, does that encourage Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt to develop nuclear weapon capability to deter Iran?
Yeah, well, it sure does, in my opinion. And as others have said, General Hayden, it does something else. It raises real alarm in the minds and hearts of our traditional allies in the Sunni Muslim world and in Israel about whether the U.S. has changed its traditional alliance relationship with those countries and now is either tilting toward Iran or at least pulling back to a kind of neutrality. And if this agreement is allowed to go into effect, I think one of the great imperatives for the U.S. is to not do whatever it can. It's going to be hard to reassure the the Arab countries, the Sunni Muslim countries, and Israel that we're still with them.
And may I have unanimous consent for one more question? General, this question. ICBMs, when Iran gets ICBMs, what would be the purpose and intent, and where would those ICBMs be able to go to from Iran?
Well, by definition, the eyes truly, as the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman said, means intercontinental. And as the Chairman pointed out, those kinds of weapons have no real military or even coercive political utility if they just have a high explosive warhead on it. It doesn't necessarily have to be nuclear, but it has to be a weapon of mass destruction. And of course—
Where could they go?
Well, if they're an intercontinental ballistic missile, they can reach North America.
They could even reach Texas.
Sir.
All right. I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go to Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Well, reaching Texas, now we're talking crazy. Thank you all for being here. What a stimulating and challenging conversation. And I think we members of Congress face a very challenging vote sometime probably in September. And Senator Lieberman, welcome back to your home. I must say, Senator Lieberman, I'm troubled by things you've said here today. You agreed with Congressman McCall. You said you agree with everything he said. One of the things he said was, why engage with Iran at all? Do you think it was a mistake to engage with Iran at all?
Thanks, Congressman, for welcoming me back. I'm probably too reflexively effusive toward anybody who's a chairman of a Homeland Security Committee. It's a bias I have. On that particular point, I don't, and I think I've said that. Okay. I didn't oppose the negotiations. I mean, I did not oppose the negotiations. I thought It was encouraging that the negotiations were occurring. Much preferable to have a peaceful resolution to this conflict. But what I'm saying this morning is that I think the result on first look, just came out a few hours ago, is that this deal is not a good one for the U.S. or our allies, and it is a very good one for Iran.
Yes, I heard you say that. In fact, I heard you counsel us we should vote no. Seems awfully early to do that, but apparently you've made up your mind. Well, I haven't.
No, I understand, and I just wanted to share that with you based on what was agreed to at Lausanne, which is in April, which basically says this will be a temporary freeze on the Iranian program if they keep their word, and then they have the way clear to become a nuclear power.
I understand, and I think some of the questions you've raised are absolutely legitimate, as are General Hayden's, but I think we have to weigh the alternative.
Absolutely. We
can't pretend that there's a perfect alternative if we'd only choose it. And I think that's some of the problems, some of the discussion we have around here. But you also said we can just go back to the P5+1 and say we just couldn't sell it. Let's start over again and let's re-engage the Iranians. Senator Lieberman, I don't know anybody who believes that has any high probability of success. That, as a matter of fact, the very opposite is likely to happen. If we disavow this agreement, P5+1 falls apart, and Iran races, not walks, to accelerate its nuclear development program, and they're not about to come back to the table. Surely you would at least concede that's just as likely as the scenario you laid out.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I actually agree with what Ambassador Burns said here, that if the agreement is rejected, that Iran will not rush to build a nuclear weapon. They'll retool their program, but they won't do it because they'll worry that either the U.S. or Israel, if there is clear intelligence showing that they've broken out to a nuclear weapons capacity, that the U.S. or Israel will attack them militarily, and they don't want that.
I take your point, and that's one thing we can consider. But surely there's a chance that's not what's going to happen. And when we're thinking about voting, we have to weigh those risks.
Absolutely. Look at this.
And at least the agreement in front of me limits the risk. It's a completely unlimited risk. You may be right. They won't do that. But what if you're wrong? What if, in fact, they will go down? There is a hardline element, as you point out, in Tehran that would be licking its chops to see this agreement fall apart.
I tell you, I think that all the elements in Iran want this agreement because it's so good for them economically, and it strengthens their position in the Middle East, doesn't do anything to stop them from supporting, in fact, helps them support their proxies throughout the region more than they are now.
Senator Lieberman.
But you know, Congressman Kennedy, I just want to say, I'm going to agree with you that I can't predict what will happen. I can't predict with certainty any more than anybody can what will happen if Congress rejects the agreement. I can just say that from what I've seen this morning and based on what I saw come out of Lausanne in April, this agreement has more risk for the U.S. and more reward for Iran than I hoped it would.
One final point, and by the way, I would just note for the record, actually there were hardline elements protesting these negotiations in Iran. I do not agree with you that there's unanimity of opinion in Iran that this is a great deal for Iran. I think the evidence suggests otherwise. But you also in your statement earlier said this will strengthen the hardline in Iran, freeing up resources that they can use for bad things. Would you at least concede that, again, there's an alternative scenario in which actually that's not what happens. It actually reinforces the Rouhani element and others that engagement with the West actually produces good economic things for us, and we should do more of it. Isn't it at least worthy of conceding that also could be true?
It's possible. It is. But I think the much more likely is that the billions of additional dollars that the Iranian government and economy will get will be used by the IRGC, which is, as I said earlier, the Ayatollah and the IRGC are the powers in Iran, and they will be the ultimate beneficiaries of this additional money, not the moderates. I wish the moderates were, but I don't believe they will be.
Can I just comment on one thing, Congressman?
Yes, certainly.
On the issue of what happens if Congress rejects this deal. I went to college in the 1980s, and it was possible at that time to major in something called arms control.
You're such a young man, Dr. Tucker.
And I have to say that for a while I did, and I have gone back to all those arms control. It happened all the time. SALT I, SALT II were repeatedly renegotiated, various provisions of it, because of congressional objections. So Senator Lieberman's idea that upon disapproval, the United States administration has to go back and renegotiate is actually the way arms control typically happened with big bad Soviet Union. Second of all, let me just play out the string that has been put here. Let's say the United States disapproves this agreement, overrides the president's veto, and the entire international community blames the United States, becomes very censorious, and Iran begins to develop its capacities and rush toward a bomb. Surely the international community will not countenance that. They may think Americans were irresponsible, unwise, injudicious, intemperate for destroying a deal. But if they're seeing Iran edge toward some sort of a weapons threshold, surely they would rejoin the United States in imposing some sort of a measure to prevent that, I would imagine.
My time is up.
Yeah, we'll go to Matt Salmon of Arizona, if we could.
Thank you. Senator Lieberman, during your time as a senator, you were afforded the opportunity to vote on a few treaties, I suspect. Why do you think that the administration pursued this as more of a political agreement than a treaty? What was the rationale for that? I mean, I've heard several times today that this is probably the most important decision Congress has weighed in on. Some have said in the last 30, 40 years, some have said in the last 50 years. With that important of a decision, why would it be pursued as a political agreement rather than a treaty?
So, you mean literally?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think the administration, if they were here, would say it's a political agreement, but they'd say it's a diplomatic negotiation and not a treaty. I will tell you myself, and this is a closed issue, that what's on the line as a result of this agreement between the P5+1 and Iran is much more consequential than any treaty I was asked to vote for or against in my 24 years in the Senate. And of course, if it was considered a treaty, then it would require 2/3 to pass, not the other way around. But the President, under the Constitution and established court decisions, has the clear right to make the decision he did. This is not a treaty, but it is an international agreement, and it has to meet different standards in Congress.
I think that many of the cynics believe that the reason is because the President could have never succeeded in crossing that 2/3 threshold in the Senate. And given the fact that, as you said, you voted on treaties that had far less consequence than this document. General Hayden, you stated that the inspections have become a political, not a technical issue. And so one of my questions is that whether you believe the Obama administration and its P5+1 partners would ultimately make the political decision to call out any violations of the agreement. I mean, whether they're technical in nature or small in nature or large in nature, do you think that the administration, who's kind of staking its whole reputation on this agreement, would have the political will to call out any infractions and make them public, knowing that the political ramifications could be quite stark?
You bring up a great point, Congressman. It seems maybe even a little counterintuitive because we're all concerned about Iranian cheating. But once the agreement goes into effect, the burden of proof on, well, let me just go back into my previous life and walk into the Oval Office and say, well, you know, Mr. President, that treaty that was so important to both you and to the country, I think these guys are violating it. The time I would need and the body of evidence that would be required to turn that into political action is a dynamic we used to call in the business the dynamic of the unpleasant fact. It takes always more evidence and more time to generate action. But beyond that, though, Congressman, that's just inside the American bubble. Look at it from the P5+1.
Right.
And how many other folks have a real vested interest in not admitting that violations have taken place. And so I am really concerned about the managed access regime, since it will be at the political, not the technical level.
Well, in the snapback, so to speak, whether it's a snapback of our sanctions or a snapback of international sanctions, has immense financial implications to many of these countries involved. And so the likelihood that they would speak out of a violation, I'm worried that those violations will just be swept under the rug and that we'll never even see the light of day. As described, I cannot and I will not support this deal. Iran has proven time and time again it can't be trusted to meet international obligations and agreements. I believe this administration is naive to suggest that the hundreds of billions of dollars Iran will gain access through this agreement will not be used to continue the proliferation of terrorism across the globe. On the contrary, those terrorism efforts will only get better funded. And furthermore, despite the President's rather bold statement, this agreement will ensure that the Islamic Republic of Iran will not develop a nuclear weapon. In reality, it puts them on a path towards legitimately developing and possessing a nuclear bomb in just 10 years. And I'm wondering, this administration's had a penchant for doing things that only have effect during, or has a shelf life during his administration, with no thought of consequences to the hereafter, to our children, our grandchildren. I think that this is a frightening deal, and it also didn't address the Americans that remain hostages in Iran. In fact, I'm really disgusted that they weren't even really front and center in any of the negotiations. They were sideline comments at best. For all the reasons stated above, I cannot support this deal at all, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Congressman Solomon. We now proceed to Congressman Brian Higgins of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank the panel. You have been very professional. You have a body of knowledge individually and collectively that is invaluable to our deliberations on this issue. You know, a lot's been talked about the nuclear infrastructure, centrifuges, the proliferation of them over the past 10 years, which is disturbing. This deal cuts them by 2/3, which I think is very, very significant. Also, the material that is used, the nuclear material. You have, under this agreement, as I understand it, less than 4% of enrichment of that material, which is a far distance from bomb-grade material. And then you have the inspections process, which I think is important. But I don't think enough has been focused on the Iranian people and the politics of Iran, which I think are very significant here. The military historian David Christ wrote a book, The Twilight War. He says since 1979 revolution, there have been 7 attempts by either side to improve relations, and they all failed. And against that history, this nuclear deal, or anticipated nuclear deal, when he was writing at the time, was uncharted territory. And I think when you look at what's going on in Iran today, you know, in the last 5 years, their currency has lost half its value. There's been 50% inflation, meaning that whatever you had in the bank prior to all of this was worth half, and whatever you were buying cost you twice as much. Rouhani won an election as a reformist. Within that context, it's not the American projection of what we would view as a reformist, but, you know, he was pretty vocal about how bad the Iranian economy was, not only during the election, but after he won. You know, the difference, in large part, from '79 to currently, Iranian officials are turning on each other. And I think that reflects that in this nation of some 80 million people, you've got probably 65 million people who are very, very young and want normalization with the rest of the world. And then you have the hardliners, made up of the Revolutionary Guard and Quds forces, Qasem Soleimani. It's been said here and in many panels previously what a destructive force he is relative to stability in the region, with, you know, his work in being on the ground in Iraq, directing the Shia militias, saving Bashar al-Assad in the 11th hour, and their support of Hezbollah. But because of the deteriorating economic situation in Iran, the Quds forces and the Revolutionary Guard benefit. Why? Because they control all the smuggling, which is made necessary by the horrific situation economically in Iran. I'm just here to say that, I think this 10-year period is very, very important because really nobody knows with certainty what will happen. But what in fact could happen is a normalization with the rest of the world, the promotion of a more diversified, legitimate economy in Iran could in fact undermine the current regime and produce the kind of changes that the vast majority of young Iranians want. And just kind of wanted your thoughts on that.
I think some of your diagnosis is correct in terms of the notion of population estranged from the regime. And the question is the effect of this particular agreement on the regime. I think whatever the lifespan of the Islamic Republic may be, and I do think there's a termination date, has actually been extended by an agreement that legitimizes this program and leads to infusion of economic resources. You can make a case, and frankly quite a good one, that the longevity of Kim dynasty in North Korea has had something to do with his possession of nuclear weapon and attempt to leverage that in terms of gaining tribute from the international community.
Yeah, but
so
North Korea they love their isolation. They don't want anything to do with the rest of the world. But
either does the Iranian regime at this point, at the level of institutional arrangements.
Yeah, but again, I think what's going on here is there is a dichotomy within the politics of Iran, and there is a significant and growing population that wants normalized relations with the rest of the world and wants to see that economy unleash the potential of the Iranian people.
I think you can say the exactly same thing about North Koreans. I don't think they want to live in this hermetic kingdom.
I would just say that you can't compare North Korea and Iran. In this situation, Iran is not a monolithic political culture. There's a very strong reform movement. Demographically, the young people are in the ascendancy. They are a trading culture. They're entrepreneurial. They want to be connected with the rest of the world. And I think if you're looking for change and you want to build a case, that's the case that you'd make. So I agree very much with your comments.
Congressman, I think what you've laid out is quite plausible. I don't think it's likely, but it is quite plausible. Clearly, the Ayatollah has decided that this agreement will not facilitate regime change. Otherwise, he would not have signed it.
I agree. Plausible, optimistic scenario. I wish it were so. I think not likely, because I think this agreement strengthens the current government of Iran, which is the Ayatollah and the Republican Guard. But the hope here, but we've never really, as America, supported it, is that clearly, whatever the numbers are, there's a very significant number of the Iranian people who would like to be freed of this fanatical regime. Unfortunately, this regime will not let go of power, and in the event of an uprising is more likely to respond the way their proxy Assad did in Syria, which was to turn their weapons on the people.
Thank you very much. We now proceed to Congressman Darrell Issa of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Lieberman, does that mean that you're pessimistic about peace in our time when it comes to Iran?
Yeah, I must say, if my wife were here, she would say that I'm an optimist by nature, and I am, but I am pessimistic about peace in our time with Iran because I don't see any fundamental change in their radical ideology and their aggressive support of terrorism.
Well, Ambassador Burns, I normally agree with a great deal of what you come up with from scratch yourself based on your experience. But in this case, I'm going to ask you questions more related to the deal. The distinguished senator, once he left office, he's by definition extremely distinguished, would not be considered to be a dove. So let's view this as doves. If this is the Chamberlain-esque appeasement that's going to work, let's review the next 10 years. Under the agreement with the Sunset Clause, during the next 10 years, incrementally, Iran is clearly going to have more money, more access to weapons, more freedom of movement
than they would if we did nothing at all under the current sanctions. Isn't that true?
Congressman, there are trade-offs here.
No, I don't want trade-offs. I just want answers. Isn't it true that under this agreement there will be a gradual easing that will give Iran access almost immediately to some, over time to the others, but over the next 10 years they will have access to more money, the ability to buy weapons, and the ability to continue developing their, at least the non-weapons portion of their nuclear ambition, correct?
And my answer is their nuclear program is going to be frozen for 10 years. They're going to be set back significantly.
Okay, and I appreciate your talking points, and I know you were brought here with talking points. I'd just like you to answer my question. I'm trying to be very, very proactive here and positive. Clearly this agreement does let them have access to money. It will let them have access in 5 years or less to large amounts of conventional weapons that they already have a lot of and have been providing them to Hamas and Hezbollah. These are all sort of the gives in this give and take. So the real question is, if they're going to have a phase-out in 10 years from now, and by the way, they clearly do continue to get to work and to use nuclear materials for purposes non-weapons related. So they're going to continue to know more about nuclear during this 10 years, even if they don't cheat on the program. That's in the base of this. The question I have to you is very simple. 10 to 15 years from now, under this agreement, assuming that the sunny side scenario that they simply break out in peace and love for their neighbors and democracy, assuming that happens, we will be safer. Assuming it doesn't happen, isn't it true that Iran will be more able to build a nuclear weapon and to wage war if they choose to 10 years from now? From where they are today, 10 years from now, they'll be able to do that with more money and no sanctions under the current agreement. Isn't that true? And that's a yes or no, please.
I was asked to testify here and to give you my best perspective.
No,
I've tried to convey a sense of how difficult this is, how complex it is.
Okay, well,
and I wasn't brought here with talking points. I came on my own volition.
Okay, well,
my view is,
Ambassador, I appreciate that.
My view is that we can stop them from becoming a nuclear weapons power 10 years from now if the President at that time is tough-minded enough to do that.
Okay, well, and that brings up sort of the history of appeasement of the Soviets. Jimmy Carter forgave them their debt, gave them a wheat that they put the hammer and sickle on and told their people it was Russian wheat, not U.S. wheat. And then Reagan took a different tact, and every president has that ability. But General Hayden, let me just go through some factual ones. 10 years ago, you were in the administration, correct?
Right.
10 years ago, is it true, without disclosing any classified information, that Iran was behind weapon enhancements in Iraq that led to Americans dying on the fields in Iraq 10 years ago?
I actually told National Security Advisor Hadley that it was a policy of the Iranian government, approved at the highest levels of that government, to facilitate the killing of American and other coalition soldiers.
20 years ago, without disclosing any classified information, to your understanding, is it true that Iran played a critical part to the U.S. airmen who were killed in Saudi Arabia?
That is my understanding.
30 years ago, 32 years ago, is it true that Iran, through its precursor to Hezbollah, took an active hand in the killing of the Marines at the barracks in Beirut? Or had a participation in support of?
I think that's true, Mr. Chairman, but I don't have the personal knowledge to give that answer to you with confidence.
Well, I chose those questions, and I'll summarize, Mr. Chairman, because 30 years ago, Iran clearly was promoting bad activities on the streets of Beirut, including kidnapping and so on. This was when they were a 5-year-old government. 20 years ago, Americans died for sure, in no small part because of Iran's hand. 10 years ago, Americans were dying. So when we look at 10 years before they get an outright go under this, and their ability to have the materials and to suit their ambitions, my only question to all of you, and General Hayden, if it's only time for one, it'd be you, If they were doing this 30 years ago, including kidnapping on the streets of Lebanon, 20 years ago they were killing Americans in Saudi Arabia, 10 years ago Americans were dying on the battlefield of Iraq, why do we believe that 10 years from now anything will really be different based on your history and intelligence, General?
And to bring it only slightly more up to date, Mr. Chairman, 3 years ago they were prepared to explode an IED at a restaurant in Georgetown to kill the Saudi ambassador. And so I don't have faith in behavior change of the government. Let me put it another way. I have hope, all right? But I don't know that we can base policy on that expectation.
Hope is not a strategy. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman Issa. We now proceed to Congresswoman Grace Ming of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our esteemed panelists for being here today. I'll state at the outset that while I'll reserve final judgment on the deal until I am able to read it through completely, I'm deeply concerned and disappointed by what appears to be in its terms. For the last couple months, I've advocated that we provide the 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs to Israel and the planes to deliver them. Now we have a deal that neglects in any way to address Iran's providing arms and support to terrorists. Furthermore, we have a deal, to our surprise, that will allow for the lifting of the arms embargo against Iran. In light of all of this and the significant deterrence that would be created by providing Israel these weapons, do you support the administration's unwillingness to provide Israel with the 30,000-pound bunker buster capability, which is totally outside the four corners of the deal? Just like to hear from anyone.
I actually support the administration's position on this. Obviously, I support the security of Israel. But I think in this instance, if force has to be used against Iran, it should be by the United States. We're much more capable. We would have much greater legitimacy internationally, given the fact that we've been leading this coalition and that we've been at the negotiating table. I fear that if Israel used force ahead of the United States, it would be I don't think it would be as effective militarily, and politically it would be difficult for the Israelis and for us. So I'd rather see the United States, if we have to use force, be the one that does it.
I'm kind of in the same place, Congresswoman. If we empower the Israelis to do that, and if they do that, I think we have given another nation the ability to put us at war. And so I agree with Ambassador Burns. Can I just throw down one additional layer? A question I genuinely have, and I'll be a little oblique here and not suggest anything behind the screen. It is obviously against our policy that Israel conduct an overt strike against the Iranian nuclear system. What are our views, and what are we prepared to do if Israel attempts covert action against the Iranian nuclear program? And what will be our policy prescription in our relationship with Israel with regard to that question?
Congresswoman, thanks for your statement and your question. I have a different point of view. I think particularly if this agreement announced today is not rejected by Congress and goes into effect, the willingness of the United States to provide Israel with the so-called MOP, the big bunker buster, will be part of a necessary strategy to regain the confidence of the Israelis. Frankly, I think it will have, even though I agree that if military action has to be taken against Iran because it's taken a nuclear breakout, it's much preferable for many reasons that the United States take that action. But I do think if this agreement is not rejected by Congress and goes into effect, the willingness of the United States to give the big bunker buster bombs to Israel will have a deterrent effect on Iran. It will encourage Iran to keep the agreement, because I think, frankly, Iran has less confidence that the Israelis won't take military action against them than they do that we won't take military action against them.
One thing to that, it seems to me that if you're looking at this agreement as the best means of safety and security of Israel, stability of the region, the best way of doing that is negotiating a stringent arms control agreement. To me, transfer of such munitions in aftermath of an agreement that is so deficient, where you have to transfer such weaponry, is attempting to mitigate the consequences of a deficient deal.
Thank you, Congresswoman Ming. And we now proceed to Congressman Randy Weber of Texas.
Thank you. I hope to have some pretty simple questions for y'all. Do y'all agree that if this agreement goes into effect, that money will ultimately find its way to Hezbollah? Yes or no?
Yes.
Pretty much all agree that that'll happen. So how much of that money is acceptable? 1 million? 5 million? How much? Would anybody give us a value?
Well, of course, I'd say none.
Ambassador? You'd say none as well? Okay. Doctor? Okay, good. So, Ambassador Burns, you said that you wished Obama's war of words with Israel would stop and that they would make up, to use your words. In your estimation, which is worse, Obama's war of words with Israel or Iran's hateful rhetoric toward the United States and Israel?
Obviously, what the Iranians have done in threatening Israel is the problem here. President Obama is not the problem. And the difficulties between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu are two-sided, and they're both responsible.
No, I just want to get you on record as saying the Iranians' rhetoric, spewing of hate, needs to stop. So there's been talk about if the veto is sustained, what would happen. Would you all agree with me that if the President said in his remarks this morning that we negotiated from a position of strength and power, something to that effect. But would you all agree with me that had we gone in there with these 7 tenets, number 1, release our hostages, number 2, halt all enrichment, 6 tenets, and do away with the centrifuges, number 3, give the IAEA unfettered 24/7 access, anytime, 24/7, 365. Number 4, stop exporting terrorism. Make sure the Hezbollah doesn't get any of that money. Number 5, stop the rhetoric toward Israel and the United States. And number 6, prove their sincerity of wanting to rejoin the world community by exhibiting this behavior for 1 or 2 years or more. Would that have been a position of strength for us to negotiate from, Senator?
Well, sure. I mean, I think, and again, I wasn't there, and it's too easy to say this from this perspective, but it felt to me, look, we're a great power, militarily, economically, culturally, every way.
Well, let me move on to General Hayden. Pardon the interruption. General,
okay.
Would that have been a position of strength?
It would have been a position of strength, but the premise of our negotiation was to narrowly focus on the nuclear question.
Okay. Ambassador, position of strength, if we required those 6 items.
I'm confident that President Bush and President Obama started there, but that's not how negotiations work.
John Kerry told me himself, I asked him about the hostage release. They were not going to make that a part and parcel of this agreement.
No, I was talking about something different.
Okay, I'm talking about all 6 of these.
In our conversations with the Iranians, all those issues are important, but you can't just insist on what you want.
Well,
negotiation.
Forgive me, Ambassador, but I think they came to us wanting relief. We didn't go to them wanting relief. Doctor, would that have been a position of strength?
General Hayden suggested that the premise of these negotiations were to resolve the nuclear issue. I do think that both President Bush and President Obama share those concerns regarding Iranian sponsorship of terrorism, regarding detaining of the American hostages, regarding other activities. I do think that that is a shared bipartisan concern, and I think that President Obama, as with President Bush, actually find Iranian treatment of our citizens and sponsorship.
But I would argue that they're all important. We've all heard the old saying, talk is cheap. Apparently, it's really not, because the Iranians are getting hundreds of billions of dollars because of their talk. We want action. We want them to demonstrate their willingness. So here's my question: if we do override the president's veto, can we come back then and negotiate from a position of strength?
I would say that I think, as General Hayden and I think Ambassador Burns suggested, going back is going to be tough. I'm not suggesting it shouldn't happen. Under some extraordinary circumstances, deficient agreements should be renegotiating, but I don't think we should minimize the impact. I think it can be done, but I don't think we should discount the difficulty of it, of actually achieving that.
Well, I agree with my colleague, Grace Ming, that we need to provide Israel with a bunker buster bomb because that may be the one threat that Iran relates to, and it may also put us to pressure to help. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Weber. We now proceed to Congressman Scott Desjardins of Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panel. I know it's getting to be a long morning. You've been sitting there a long time. We appreciate all your testimony. I think it's been reiterated a number of times today that we feel that this is a much better deal for Iran than it is the United States. And really, on paper, we should have the upper hand in these negotiations. Therefore, if it is our goal to truly ensure peace and stability in the region and prevent Iran from developing nuclear capabilities, why have we conceded to their demands, especially in regard to domestic uranium enrichment? General?
I asked the same questions, Congressman. I think a good macro view is that the Iranians needed a deal far more than we did, and we wanted a deal far more than the Iranians did. And we have made, I think it's fair to say, look, I worked with Nick in the same administration. This is really hard, and there were no easy answers. But it does appear to me that we've had a series of concessions in order to keep the Iranians still interested in the talks.
This may be an easy question for you all to answer, but for people listening and watching this hearing, why have we not stood our ground and insisted that Iran import its enriched uranium, just as other countries do, such as South Korea, Italy, Spain, and many others?
I think that we moved away from that particular parameter, I suspect, quite a while back, and maybe even during the Bush years. I don't know. The parameter that I think we should not have moved from is the position of the United States and the Russian Federation and People's Republic of China in 2013 was that Iran should have an enrichment program, but only a symbolic one that would essentially satiate their public diplomacy and public demands, but not necessarily be misused. I don't know why that position was changed in 2013.
I mean, I think it's obvious to most anyone if Iran is serious about not obtaining nuclear weapons, that's the claim they're trying to make in exchange for all this money, then they should be able to join 20 or 24 nations that are doing the same thing, importing their enriched uranium. So I think we've really dropped the ball there, and it clearly shows that Iran's intentions aren't peaceful. Ambassador Burns, do you agree with the President's assessment from April, and to quote him, what is more relevant fear would be that in years 13, 14, 15, they have advanced centrifuges that enrich uranium fairly rapidly, and at that point the breakout times would be shrunk down to almost zero. Can you please clarify that point for me? Do you or do you not support the arbitrary sunset in the agreement?
I think I understood the President saying when he spoke in April about the interim agreement that when the agreement lapsed in the 10 to 15-year period, that's when the Iranians could reconstitute their program theoretically, and that's when the breakout time would begin to diminish, as he said, almost down to zero. But I think he was talking about the period beyond the freeze of the first 10 years.
So you think it's a good idea for, do you think then it's a good idea for Iran to have an industrial-sized nuclear program?
No, I don't think it's a good idea, but I think that, our President and our Secretary of State have to operate in the real world of what's possible and not possible. I think this is the best deal that they could have achieved. I support it on that basis, but obviously it's going to take a lot to make it work, and we've talked a lot about that this morning.
Ambassador, with all due respect, you're probably the only member on the panel that is openly expressing your support for Obama's deal. Yet in your opening statement, and I don't want to put words in your mouth so you can correct me, but you basically conceded that you expect Iran to cheat. Is that correct?
I think it's likely that Iran will try to cheat at some point. I think that's just an objective statement. But, I support it because I know how, having worked on this issue in the Bush administration, how difficult and complex it is. I think our national security will be met and be improved by locking them up in a box, freezing them for 10 years. And then, of course, any American president, if Iran tried to break out towards a nuclear weapon, would have the right and have the capability to stop them through military force. So I think the President and Secretary Kerry are to be commended.
Yeah, well, it looks like to me a case of Obama legacy building here, because from all the discussion we've had today, this is not a good deal. You're basically taking a hope and a prayer, hoping that the next president will be like Reagan and be able to do something to stop what this deal sets up. You think they're going to cheat. And, you know, right now, Chairman Royce started this hearing saying that they're going to take this money, this unfreezing of billions of assets, and immediately use them to build tunnels into Israel and also give them smart weapons to further endanger Israel. Do you think that's cheating?
I think that we're going to have a very tough time implementing this agreement, but I also think it's the best for our national security interests. And I also think it's going to be a generational struggle. We're in a long-term struggle with Iran, and so it's going to be up to both Republicans and Democrats to figure out a way to contain them. I worry that if Congress disapproves, votes to disapprove, and then votes to override the President's veto, which the President threatened, it'll weaken the United States and weaken our position in the Middle East, and I worry about that.
And I respectfully disagree, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Desjardins. We now proceed to Congressman Ted Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. I don't know where to start. There's so many conflicting things here, and I want to pick up with Scott. If the goal of peace, as you know, if we start from the very beginning, when this all started, I remember President Obama saying, Iran will not be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, period. 28 times he said that. They will not have it. But again, we see another red line drawn in disappearing ink. And now we're at a point of we're delaying it for 10 years, maybe, and I don't think it'll be 10 years. Sitting on this panel over and over again, I've heard the experts say that Iran has enough material to have a nuclear bomb within 6 months to a year. That was a year and a half ago. So I think we've crossed the point of what we tried to negotiate. And then Eisenhower said, if the goal is peace, is a peaceful nuclear program, a civilian nuclear program flourishes only through cooperation and openness. Secrecy and isolation are typically signs of a nuclear weapons program. And a pessimist who, this is something I read the other day, a pessimist who doesn't think peace will occur in the Middle East is an optimist that has studied Middle East history. And, you know, I think it's pretty obvious what's going on there. Ambassador Burns, you were saying that we can't see into the future, but you know, and it's maybe the Iranian people will rise and change this regime. They tried that in 2009. We didn't assist them, as Senator Lieberman said, we have in the past. We let the uprising happen. Do you think if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, and my prediction is it'll be between now and 10 years from now, they'll have one. They have all the elements for that. We know they've detonated a nuclear trigger device. Do you think that there'll be more allowing their citizens to rise up and have regime change or change their politics?
Well, I just answer you. It's a good question. I'd answer it just in just 2 points. One is I think it's not at all probable that Iran will achieve a nuclear weapon in the next 10 years. After that, then I think the calculations change first. Second, I think regime change is desirable. I would like to see a change in the regime to a democratic
it doesn't matter what we think, it's what the Iranian
But I don't think that we have the capacity to produce that change on our own.
Not now, we don't. There's an old proverb I read a long time ago, and it said that if you want to see one's past, look at their present situation. It tells you what their past efforts were, what they invested in, what their habits were. And you were saying that we can't predict what's going to go on in Iran in the future. If you want to see one's future, look at what they presently are doing, what they're investing in, their habits. And I see a country that's promoting terrorism, shouting death to Israel, death to America, propping up the Syrian regime. I can see their future, and it's not a healthy one, and they're going to be more emboldened with the nuclear weapons. Let's see. I agree with Senator Lieberman in that you were stating that you know, this is a bad deal. And I said last week, you know, being a veterinarian, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. This is a bad deal. We need to walk away from the table. And the reason I say that, and correct me if I'm wrong, because if we wait and other countries invest into that, into Iran, you know, the economic development that they're seeking, the other countries that go in there, the P5, if we wait 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years and they have that economic development, what's the likelihood of the snapback, which is a fictitious condition, of that happening if we wait 5 years versus if we walk away from the deal now, say the sanctions are back in place, we can't sell it to the American people. Senator?
Well, it's going to be harder in 3, 4, or 5 years. And of course, I hope that what you've described happens, that we walk away. But it's clear that the administration is not going to walk away voluntarily, and therefore the only way that the U.S. walks away is if Congress exercises its authority to reject this agreement and then overrides a veto.
Congressman, I just had one very quick thought. We've talked about what happens if and so on. I would offer you the view that it's a very defensible proposition, that it will be more, absent a nuclear detonation on Iran, it will be more difficult to reimpose sanctions in 5 years than it will be to sustain some sanctions if we turn our back on this agreement.
Yes, sir.
I would just like to say, Congressman, if we walk away now, then we'll have less leverage on the Iranians, and they will have a nuclear program without restrictions compared to all the restrictions they're going to be put under for the next 10 years. That's not a good deal for the United States.
But we were talking about Iran has always skirted the restrictions. You look at the UN resolutions and the sanctions, they've not lived up to those. They've been playing the cat and mouse game for over 30 years. And what I see is an administration that's incompetent on this agreement. And I think Iran has done a great job. And, you know, time will tell. But I think we should prepare for detection in the future and put the money into research and development and find out where the nuclear material is. There's that technology out there, and prepare for the day they do have a nuclear arm, because they're going to have one. And we should prepare our allies with that, and we shouldn't delay. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Yoho. We now, Congressman Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that Representative Jackson Lee be allowed to ask questions after all committee members have had the opportunity to participate.
And we have a dilemma in that Congressman Zeldin just came, and as such a gentleman, I know he would want to proceed with Congressman Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Deutsch, I would be very happy to yield to the gentlelady, Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee, for her remarks and questioning.
I think our witnesses are going to see the ultimate politeness and courtesy, and I'd only say to the Chair and Ranking Member, thank you for your courtesies, and if it is appropriate for this member of the committee to go forward, please tell me how I should proceed. I'm more than happy to follow protocol. If I've been given the time, I will handle it in the appropriate manner.
Congresswoman, the time is yours.
You all are extremely courteous, and so have these very patriotic witnesses who've come today. I serve on the Homeland Security Committee and Judiciary Committee, but I am an adopted daughter of this committee, and they have been very kind when I've had the opportunity to come, having worked a lot in the Mideast and worked with Congressman Deutsch, as well as Congressman Wilson, and as well as the chairman of the full committee and the ranking member. Let me thank them for their courtesies. Let me start both with, before I go to Senator Lieberman, who I'm so delighted to see, a fellow alum, start with General Hayden and Mr. Burns, Secretary Burns, thanking them for their leadership. The first thing that we heard as we woke to, for many, was a breakthrough and exciting news, but appropriately cautioned because of the many friends we have in the Mideast, was that this would begin an arms race for our allies, Sunnis, in particular Saudi Arabia. And I'm going to end and just ask, would you respond to that? The second question is that as we were negotiating, I was leaning toward the spontaneous inspection that would come about. I now hear that it's regulated, and you're either going to be able to go to bases or not go to bases, which gives me a concern. But if you would answer those two questions, I guess I want them abbreviated only because I have others, and I just didn't want to go on with my questions, and I have other questions. Thank you so very much.
Congresswoman, I agree with you. The managed access aspect of the inspections, I think, is very disappointing and very problematic. With regard to how the Sunnis will respond, I probably don't have the confidence to say it is inevitable that they will race in the direction of a nuclear infrastructure and a nuclear weapon, but I think it's more rather than less likely.
Secretary Burns. And thank you all for your engagement of this long process. I understand, as I've been here 13 years plus, but go ahead, Secretary.
I think President Obama's agreement diminishes the chance that the Saudis will try to obtain a nuclear weapon. It will give them some reassurance over the next 10 years that the Iranians are not going to be a nuclear weapons power themselves. So that's one of the, I think, advantages of this agreement.
Can I follow up with you, Secretary Burns? I understand the agreement sort of lays out either a 10-year, under 15-year scenario. Is that too short a period of time before we might see them, Iran, moving toward that concept of a nuclear weapon?
I think I would have preferred an entirely different set of parameters for this negotiation, an entirely different framework. But it is the framework that we've now just negotiated, and I want to see our country succeed, obviously. Well, we all do. And I think that there's a chance for success here. But it does worry me. I would have rather seen 20 years or 30 years rather than 10, if you ask me.
Then let me follow up with you. The collective body politic of those who sat around the table, having been engaged directly when Secretary Clinton was the Secretary of State, and you were dispatched to begin these discussions over the period of years, do you take comfort in the individual nations that joined the United States to be part of the enforcement of this agreement and giving it more strength for peace for all of us?
Congressman, there are a couple of people named Burns in Washington, and that's my good friend Bill Burns, who worked for Secretary Clinton.
Well, take the credit.
I wish he deserves all the credit. I
saw you looking. I said, uh-oh, it's not the same Burns, but I've worked with you so long, so go right ahead.
I worked for President Clinton.
Yes.
And President Bush.
Thank you, Bill Burns. Okay.
We should thank Bill Burns. I do think that, you know, the choice that we had was, and the choice we still have, depending what Congress does, is do we want to go it alone or do we want to lead a coalition? I think in this respect, in this case, we're stronger leading a coalition, keeping the coalition together, using the leverage of that coalition to get what we want and to see this deal implemented. I fear a congressional disapproval would put us out on our own. We're very powerful, but the Iranians would profit from a breakup of this anti-Iran coalition that the United States over 2 administrations has been able to lead.
Well, as I asked Senator Lieberman, I do not want the Iranians to profit. I have worked for a long period of time on Camp Ashraf and the individuals, Camp Liberty. I think we've seen each other and continue to want to raise this question of protecting my friends who believe in liberty and peace. And so, Senator Lieberman, how would you fix this if you are not seeing this agreement as the way it should be?
You mean on the specific question of the Iranians at Camp Liberty?
No. I am concerned that I don't give Iran too much happiness until they ultimately fix that issue.
Right.
But on this non-nuclear agreement, how would you move it to a position where you'd want it to be?
Well, the most disappointing, there are 2 parts of this that bother me. The first part was clear from the framework agreement in April in Lausanne, which was that we were not going to achieve what we originally wanted, the end of the Iranian nuclear program, in return for the end of sanctions against them. They were going to promise to freeze for 10 years if they keep the promise, and then after that we basically legalized their path to becoming a nuclear power. But as I looked at the agreement this morning with things that I hadn't seen before, the most disappointing part of it is the inspection part. It's not anywhere, anytime. It's nothing remotely like that. It allows the Iranians to object. A negotiation goes on with the International Atomic Energy Agency. It takes 14 days. There can be an appeal for 7 days. It's not clear that there's a real enforcement mechanism. This is the real hole in this agreement. And if I had my druthers, that's the part that I would dramatically change.
I'm going to conclude my remarks because this committee has been very courteous to me, and simply thank them for extending me this time, and say in conclusion that I want Congress to take its task seriously and to immerse itself in many different committees, for the Judiciary, Homeland Security, Foreign Affairs, and others, in the importance of this agreement and peace in the Mideast. I'd finally say I want to thank this committee for its concern of my friends in Camp Liberty and Camp Ashraf. They are still not where they need to be, treated with dignity, allowed to get medical care, and as we proceed, I think it would be appropriate to continuously raise these issues with Iran, who seems to want legitimacy, world legitimacy, and they cannot get world legitimacy by the inhumane treatment, putting aside the nuclear efforts that this administration has worked so extensively on, and I want to congratulate President Obama for his extensive efforts. But if they're going to get world notice for being a country that is in the world arena with dignity for all of its persons, then they are not at that place right now, in my mind, because of the horrific treatment of some of their own citizens, and particularly those that are fighting for justice and equality and freedom over in Camp Ashraf and, of course, Camp Liberty. So I thank you so very much, and I yield back my time. Thank you for your courtesy.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We now proceed to Congressman Lee Zeldin of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the distinguished panel for being here, as well as your service to our country in many different ways, including being here this morning. I know that you've been here for a few hours. It's now afternoon, and I just want to say thank you as well for being so generous with your time with the committee on such a very timely, important appearance. I don't need to wait 30 days or 60 days to decide that this is a bad deal, that's an unacceptable deal. It's okay to be open-minded. It doesn't mean that a requirement to be open-minded is that we're naive. It's a bad deal. And I think about, I have a really important question for you. You've worked for presidents, just a tremendous amount of generations of administrations over the course of your time in government. The next president comes in, whoever the person is, Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter. That person decides that something that wasn't even part of these negotiations, they are motivated to tackle. So just briefly recapping some of the stuff that weren't even part of the negotiations. Iran overthrowing foreign governments, sponsoring terror, financing terror, developing ICBMs, unjustly imprisoning United States citizens, including a pastor, a reporter, a United States Marine, developing well, I mean, they're pledging to wipe Israel off the map. They're chanting death to America in the streets. The list goes on. We're handing them the $50 billion signing bonus, but we're not even giving it to them with strings attached that they can't use the money to continue to finance terror. I mean, these people have blood on their hands from U.S. service members who have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. All this wasn't even part of the negotiations. So a president comes into office, it's January of 2017, and let's just say, God forbid, that any of these U.S. citizens are still being imprisoned, or they decide that we need to stop allowing them to overthrow foreign governments, or we need to cut off a funding supply to Hezbollah. Whatever the scenario is, the next president's motivated. If we give away all of these sanctions right now, tactically, what are the options that are left? The reason why the Iranians are at the table right now is because the sanctions were working. What is the impact of this deal on that motivation to tackle all of the other actions we have an issue with?
Congressman, we did not have sustained contact with the Iranians from 1979 until the autumn of 2013, so we had an abnormal relationship. We couldn't actually mix it up with them and really get in there and work with them and try to move them and leverage them. We've got that now. Now, the Obama administration made a tactical decision that for the life of these nuclear talks, they didn't want to introduce any other issues. You can argue pro or con whether that was the right decision. We do have the capacity to talk to them now. Secretary Kerry has he's a relationship of sorts, a professional relationship with the Iranian foreign minister. And I think I wouldn't wait to the next president. I think the Obama administration should take on the hostage issue and take on the terrorism issue and the regional issue and try to do what we can to motivate the Iranians to change their positions. It's going to be tough.
I mean, the Iranians they weren't negotiating with us because they're good actors, they're good world citizens. These are bad people blowing up mock U.S. warships while this is going on, fighting with the Syrians and the Houthis in Yemen against us and others. What is the leverage to actually, other than say, you know, for Obama to, you know, to go back, you know, a few months from now, or Secretary Kerry to go over and say, you know, pretty please, can you stop overthrow foreign governments? What's the actual leverage that's left other than asking nicely?
I think I'm not sure I'd ask nicely, but I think the actual leverage is to strengthen our military relationship with the GCC countries, the Saudis and others, to contain Iranian power in the Gulf, to close ranks with Israel, strengthen that relationship, and make it difficult for the Iranians to do what they're doing in the Middle East.
But why would the Iranians do anything that I just said if what they want we're just giving them right now with this deal? In my opinion, the President of the United States should be sitting down at the table with a strong hand, inheriting all that goodwill of generations of Americans who have fought and died for this country to keep us free and safe. And with that goodwill and that American exceptionalism, say, this is everything that we want in exchange for $50 billion plus of sanctions relief, but all the stuff was left out. So I guess what do we have to give the Iranians now that the sanction relief, if the sanction relief was met, what do we have to give the Iranians as leverage to get what we want out of them?
So the decision the Obama administration made was to focus on the nuclear issue as the greatest immediate danger. I think that was a correct decision. Now that that is underway and you have an agreement that hopefully will be implemented, we're going to have to build up our power and our coalitions against Iran. It's not about giving them something they want. It's about out-muscling them and outpowering them through containment regimes. And that's what the United States traditionally has done, going back to the Carter administration. When we said the Persian Gulf is an area of vital concern to the United States, we should say it again to warn the Iranians about military activities, for instance, in that area.
And my time running short here, I appreciate that. I think that for the life of the Obama administration, or at least this particular moment in time, no one in the entire world, whether it's within the United States or the Middle East or elsewhere, believe if the president says that the military option is on the table, that he would actually do it. We saw what happened with Syria, where there would be consequences for using chemical warfare. They used chemical weapons, and nothing ended up happening. So, you know, the president says the only alternative to whatever he agreed to was war. And the irony about it is that this deal will actually result in more instability in the Middle East and cause, you know, nuclear arms race to some degree in that region as well. I'm just concerned that the president has negotiated away that leverage that brought the Iranians to the table in the first place. America got played, and the president was complacent party to it. Now, the American public and the representatives in Congress, we should have the final say, not the president with a stroke of a pen. An announcement this morning made at the White House that was filled with falsehoods like 24/7, anytime, anywhere inspections that aren't real. I really do appreciate all of you being here. I'm just concerned about the future of our relations. And I'm sorry,
yeah,
General Hayden.
one additional thought, maybe a little more aggressive than what Nick just suggested. You know, live by executive order, die by executive order. You are not going to lift these sanctions. The president is going to use his authority within your legislation to lift sanctions based upon his executive decision. A future executive can reverse those decisions.
I'm just concerned that when you get rid of sanctions that take 8 years to put into place, and then you talk about snapback sanctions, when you're working with foreign governments and foreign entities, it's very difficult to just snap them back.
No, it is. But with regard to our national sanctions, you're not going to repeal the law. I think that's very clear. And so we will ease those sanctions based upon the will of the executive, which can be changed.
And I appreciate the General's remarks, and I would encourage my colleagues in the spirit of that discussion of what power Congress has or hasn't, or what power the American public has or hasn't, that we do not accept defeat, that we do not accept a bad deal with Iran because of the consequences. But I absolutely appreciate the General's remarks and the Ambassador and everyone else for being here. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Chairman, for being generous with me.
Well, thank you, Congressman Zeldin, and thank you for your military service, too, for our country. God bless you. We now proceed with Congressman Ron DeSantis of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses. You know, a lot of what goes on here is just kind of we puff. We do these hearings. We take kind of meaningless votes about really frivolous issues. This is really a big vote and a big issue. And Congress needs to step up and do the right thing for the American people. In my judgment, that means stopping the deal. I think this is bad for our country. I think it's bad for national security. You know, when I was in Iraq, back in 07, 08, the #1 cause of death was not even al-Qaeda in Iraq at the time. It was Iran and the Quds Force and the Shiite militias that they funded, and they killed hundreds of our service members. And yet I'm looking through this deal, and I noticed that they're actually relieving sanctions on the Quds Force and on Qasem Soleimani specifically. Of course, the $140 billion, that's a huge influx of cash to the Iranian regime. Is the regime going to change? Well, I just looked on Friday, July 10th, the regime sponsoring the protests, Death to America, Death to Israel on Quds Day. I think that the agreement really enhances Iran's power in the region. I think that they're going to emerge from this unquestionably the dominant actor in the Middle East. And when we've seen their authority grow over the course of this administration, I think it's actually good for ISIS, because in a place like Al-Anbar province where I serve, if the choice is between an Iraqi government that's backed by a Shiite power and Shiite militias or ISIS, which is at least a Sunni Arab group, a lot of those folks who aren't bad people, they're more apt to side with ISIS than to side with the central government of Iraq. And so the fear is that with U.S. policy tilting so far in the direction of this dominant Shiite power, that I think you're going to see more recruits now flood into ISIS. And so we may be killing some of them, but there's going to be folks who are going to replenish it. The verification, as I read it, is a joke. I mean, it's not any time we want to go in. There's a committee, they do this, they do. By the time you actually want to see things, the offending conduct could be concealed. And I think this really turns our back on Israel, our most trusted ally in the region. This is a country that Iran boasts as a one-bomb country. They bomb that they boast that they want to wipe them off the map. And I think the relationship that this administration's had with the Israeli government has been a disaster. And I don't think this is the way that you treat an ally. Well, let me ask you this, Ambassador Burns, because I think you actually did as good a job, I mean, as anyone I've heard, of justifying your position. What would be the reason to remove sanctions off of Qasem Soleimani and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps?
Oh, it's a extraordinarily difficult thing to do, isn't it? Given
but I don't understand. I mean, if
it's because of how the negotiations were constructed.
So it's just a concession, really having nothing to do with the nuke program, or does it have something to do? Because on the one hand, we're told that Iran never had military uses for any of this, but yet you're removing sanctions off folks who are very key players in Iran's military complex. So the question is there a relationship there, or is this a totally unrelated concession about relieving sanctions off people who are involved in terrorism? And we had been told from administration witness after administration witness sitting right where you are that they didn't want to discuss terrorism. They only wanted to focus on the nuclear negotiations. So it's very, very odd to me that that would be in there, and particularly just because of the blood that they have, the American blood that they have on their hands.
Right, and I think that the agreement announced this morning is framed such that all the sanctions that were passed against Iran in the Security Council and in other places, executive orders, are going to be lifted, whether they're about directly the nuclear program or not. So is it a problem that the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps might have more money available to them? Yes, it's a problem. It's part of, when I testified earlier, Congressman, I just said, I support this. I think on balance, it's the right decision for the United States. But there are risks here, and there are trade-offs, and some of them are very difficult to digest. That's one of them.
Senator Lieberman, this influx of cash to the regime, is there any doubt in your mind that some of those proceeds are going to be used to fund the Iranian terror network?
None at all. It's hard to conceive of a situation where that doesn't happen. How much is spent is up to, obviously, the Iranian authorities. The other thing I mentioned briefly before you were here, Congressman, is that a lot of the rest of the money may go for domestic purposes, but it will be used to strengthen the position of the current radical regime in Tehran and to essentially undercut the popular opposition that is there.
And getting the cash, is that going to cause the regime to change their militant Islamic ideology in your judgment?
Getting the
fact that they're getting these concessions, I guess the hope is that, oh, maybe they will change. Is there any chance, would you be willing to bet that these mullahs will change their militant Islamic ideology?
Right. I'd bet that they will not, based on everything we've seen. And the agreement strengthens their hand. In other words, as you've said, and again, as Ambassador Burns said, tough choices in a negotiation. But basically, the negotiation did focus on the nuclear program that they have. And it's not that we accepted all the terrible things that they do, but implicitly, it was off the table. Now, Congress does have a role to play here in the months ahead, which is to come back, and the administration too, really, to strengthen sanctions based on human rights, support of terrorism, their treatment of the people in Camp Liberty, which is horrendous. So that right now, I think this message is, not only did they get a good deal on the nuclear agreement, but they're basically free to do whatever they want to do in every other part of their radical program.
Thanks. Yield back.
Thank you, Congressman DeSantis, and thank you, too, for your military service. We have one final follow-up from Congressman Deutsch for Ambassador Burns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Burns, I just wanted to follow up on that last point, since it's a very big agreement that we're going to be sorting through. But your assessment is that all of the sanctions on the IRGC are being lifted as part of this? I just want to make sure that I understood correctly what you said.
In my response to Mr. DeSantis' question, I said that the framework of this agreement is that many of the sanctions that were passed under varying authorities, Security Council and others, are being lifted as part of the overall agreement. So there are multiple types of sanctions in here. That was my answer.
Okay, I appreciate that. Yield back. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. As we conclude, I want to thank each of you for being here today. Your insight has been very helpful. We're certainly concerned for the security of the American families, and you have expressed that. And you can see it's bipartisan, the level of concern and participation. I'm very, very grateful for everyone participating today. I know that many of us are just so hopeful for democratic change actually in Iran. With that, we are now adjourned.
We have like 10 minutes to get this gear out of here.
Oh,
Oh,